Hi, my name is Michael Andrew, and I'm about to give you your free tutorial on the awesome Nikon D780. If you're an experienced photographer coming from another system and you want to jump to a specific topic, hit Command F or Control F, type in the topic you're interested in. It should highlight it if we have it in our table of contents next to the time code. Click on the time code and it will jump you to that specific chapter. This tutorial is designed to be a video handbook, similar to the manual that you got with your camera. I personally find it a lot easier to watch somebody and listen to them explain it than reading through a manual. So I hope you find this helpful. If you're newer to photography, I have to give you a word of warning. This video is not going to be enough for you to go out and consistently take great images. There's a number of other things you're going to have to learn, such as the photography basics and about lighting and about composition. You're going to want to know how the camera changes according to the type of subject we're shooting. For example, if I'm shooting sports, I would approach that very differently than when I'm approaching a landscape or a portrait or any other type of shooting. There's different rules to each of these. And the reason why I say this is because when I first got started, I had to learn through trial and error, and it took me 2 years. Because of this, I have designed a Nikon D780 Crash Course that will simplify the process, streamline it, and get you shooting on a very advanced level very quickly. I've been doing this for 13 years now, and I believe my training videos are the best in the world. If you're interested in the Nikon D780 Crash Course, I will put the link in the description. Now, if that course is not available by the time you watch this, I'll put a link to my blog. Go to my website, leave your name and your email address, and we will reach out to you as soon as it's ready. In any event, we have a tremendous amount of information to cover, so let's get started. When we're first getting started with our Nikon D780, it's very important to notice we have this little dimple here, and it's like a little dot, and we're gonna rotate this clockwise as I'm pushing down on the lens release. And you're going to notice that this dot lines up with the dot on the camera body, and this is to orient our lenses. And then now we can see into the body housing, the sensors behind there. And what this does for us is that when we connect a lens, I got a 50mm 1.4 here, we're going to see a similar dot on the lenses. We'll talk a little bit more about FX versus DX lenses, but this is a full frame camera, and therefore we want full frame lenses. Something else I want to point out about the lenses, if you look underneath the cap, you're always going to get the filter size. It's 58mm in this case. And that is going to tell us the threads around the lens itself. But I'm just going to put this lens on here real quick so we can get started. And you'll hear it lock. When you're ready to take off the lens, you just push that button down and rotate it again. I always like to kind of wiggle it to make sure it's in position. Let's talk about memory cards real quick. The ones that I love are the Extreme Pros by SanDisk. This is a UHS 1 card. You know this is a UHS 1 card when you see the number of rows of pins. So let me get another one here. UHS 1, UHS 2. And our D780 is compatible with UHS 2 cards, which are faster in terms of clearing the buffer. So if you do a lot of sports shooting, things of that nature, you're going to want the UHS 2 pins. I'm going to put both of these cards in the camera. This is a Lexar, still pretty fast. But the important thing that I want you to note is this little icon right here that says U, and there's a 3 inside of that. That is the minimum standard for a sustained 4K write speed. So if you're going to be doing 4K video, it's not like any card you find laying in your desk is going to work. You have to have a sustained writing speed on your memory card. And these are my favorites. I love them. I have a UHS 2 card, but I'm using it to actually record right now. And to put the memory cards in, we're going to open up the door. And the cool thing about this is we get 2 card slots, which is something a lot of photographers complain about when there's only one, because they want something to back up their files as they're shooting an important event, a commercial shoot or a wedding. They'll get 2 copies in case one of the cards fails. And so a lot of professional shooters, they really want the 2 card slots. And that's the thing about the D780. It seems and it feels like a very polished. It has pretty much all the features you would want in a camera. Next, we're going to talk about the battery. This is the brand new EN-EL15B. It's the same size and shape as previous Nikon batteries. It's supposedly improved. So you should definitely be able to use older Nikon batteries in the D780 if you have them laying around. If you can see in there, we got the pins towards the camera. So I always think pins towards the camera. Put it in all the way until you hear it click. And when you want to release it, obviously you're going to slide this orange lever here and then we can lock the camera like that. I want to take you on an overview and just a walkthrough of the external buttons and ports, just to share the name, get you a little bit more familiar with it, a little bit more comfortable. Obviously, we have the power switch that rotates from off to on. And there's a little light bulb here. If you push it even further, that will give us an illumination of the top LCD display. And obviously, we have the shutter button. And if this is your first high-end professional camera, something to keep in mind is that there's a resting position, there's a halfway depression, and there's a full depression that will actually take the picture. And it's very handy in the beginning just to feel that soft resistance to the halfway, mid-stop clicking position, because that is how we engage focus. We do a halfway shutter button depression to focus the camera, and we push down all the way, it takes the picture. So this is a very handy skill set to know of. I love that we can grab the camera and turn it on and off as we're holding it with one hand. Some cameras have the power switch over here. Not a huge fan of that. Now, directly in front of the power button, we have this rotating wheel for our index finger. And just for the sake of simplicity, I like to refer to it sometimes as the front control wheel or the front dial. Behind the power switch, we have the video record button, our ISO button, which is going to deal with a boost in the signal that we're getting through the camera. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And our exposure compensation button. Over on the left side of the camera, very important, this is our mode dial. The mode dial is going to tell the camera how to help us. Essentially, it's going to do some of the heavy lifting for us in all the modes except manual. We'll talk about those modes in detail. To change your modes, we're going to push the center control pin and rotate the mode dial to the different mode settings. You can hear it snap. If we don't push on the button, it'll lock. Now, at the base of the mode dial, I'll give you another view of this. We have another dial that rotates by pushing this guy right here. And this is our drive or our release mode, which is what the camera does after we push a shutter button down, and it deals with whether it's a single shot, multiple frames, a timer, and we change those modes by rotating in this fashion. This is the hot shoe mount. In the full crash course, I will give you a complete lesson on how to use an external speed light. I recommend starting with the Godox TT685N, and stands for Nikon. It's a very affordable flash, very powerful, and you can do a lot of great things with it. This is where we would connect that external flash. And then we have our LCD monitor. I'll go over some of the information that we see there in just a minute. On the inside of the grip of the camera, we have a button here that says PV, and that is a preview for our depth of field. So when you're looking through the optical viewfinder and you want to see your depth of field in real time, the idea is you push this and it stops the aperture blades down, and it can give you a preview. Beginning photographers have a harder time seeing the difference in depth of field, when they push this button. I would say don't worry about it right now. And then we also have down here is the FN button, or the function button. And we can customize these buttons to do different things depending on our shooting style and the functions that we like. Now, on the opposite side of the camera, something I want to talk about real quick is because I get so many questions about this, is that many Nikon lenses, most of them, will have an autofocus to manual switch. And if your lens is pointed to M, you're in the manual focus mode and the camera will not be doing any of the focusing. And this gets bumped, and photographers will wonder, hey, how come my lens isn't focusing? And it's typically because of this lens is switched. Now, that said, there is an autofocus selector. It's kind of an obscure place. Nikons and Fujis have them on the front of the camera, and it's pointed to autofocus as well as manual focus. Now, this lever, if it's on M, again, your camera is not going to focus. So if you're having focusing problems, these are two good places to look in the beginning. And there's also a button on this lever that is going to allow us to change the focusing modes, and I'll show you how to do this in the focusing lesson. Just above it, we have the lens release. As we discussed, we have our lens mount indicator. It's a little white dot. And then we have the bracketing button. I'll demonstrate what this is and what this does a little bit later. And then we have our flash exposure compensation. This deals with changing the brightness of flashes. And again, I will demonstrate how this works on the full crash course. We're going to take a look underneath the rubber gaskets and ports on the side here. We have a Wi-Fi and Bluetooth indicator, and I'll be demonstrating how to use the Nikon app to connect wirelessly to our camera a little bit later in the lesson. Under this first gasket, we have our microphone and our headphone jack ports. So if you're doing any kind of video recording, you're definitely going to want to use an external microphone. I actually carry a microphone that I have tested and designed and worked with a manufacturer that will allow you to get started. I will put that link in the description. And then headphones allow us to preview and to listen to the sound coming into the camera. Really helpful to avoid problems. Below that, we have our remote terminal jack, which there's an accessory that we can plug in here to control some of the camera settings. And then we have our USB and our HDMI out. Both of these have great functions. If you want to shoot tethered to a computer, for example, you would use the USB connector. If you want to put video signal out of the camera into an external recorder, we would use the HDMI terminal. Let's talk about the back of the camera. There's a lot going on back here. One of the more important controls is right here, the rear control wheel. Sometimes I call it the secondary control wheel. We have a directional pad, which will allow us to move our focusing squares when we're looking through the viewfinder. We have our auto focus lock, auto exposure lock button. We have our auto focus on button, and many of these buttons can be customized in different ways. Very useful for back button focusing if you do a lot of sports shooting. This lever here allows us to determine, as designated by the icons, whether we're in still mode or in video mode. So just by flipping the switch over, and we can also press LV for live view. This is going to turn the back monitor on and allow us to use the monitor, for example, to preview the shot and see how bright the image is going to be. When you turn it off, you're probably going to be going into the optical viewfinder, which allows us to see through a pentaprism down to a mirror and then through the lens, and allows us to focus and see in real time. Something you'll notice that these buttons on the left-hand side of the camera, some of them have additional lettering and icons. What's going on here? We'll walk you through each of these. This button here is the deep menu button. We're going to be talking a lot about this a little bit later on. And just below that, we have the question mark icon, which is going to be used when we're navigating the deep menu. If we have question about certain items, this will give us a brief description. The key icon will allow you to protect your images. Below that, we have the magnifying glass, and to the left of that, we have image quality. Below that, we have the zoom out. If we want to look at sets of pictures, that's what the checkerboard is. It allows us to zoom out even further. We can scroll through dozens of images at a time. And then this icon here is the metering mode, which is how the camera is measuring light. The question about these buttons is, how do you bounce back and forth between each of them? And the answer is, it depends on what you're doing. For example, if we're in the menu and we push the question icon, is when we're navigating the deep menu. If we're in a shooting mode, now it is for navigating our white balance controls. It wants me to push and hold. And the same is true with these other features. If we're in a shooting mode or a playback mode of an image, the magnifying glass is going to zoom in directly, and the zoom out obviously is going to zoom out. In the case of the metering, if we're zoomed out already, we can push and hold, and it will allow us to access the metering modes. So for example, let's say we wanted to access quality. Well, when we're in this live view screen, it thinks we want to zoom in. So what we would do is exit live view, press the quality button, and then we can navigate the different qualities that I'll be talking about in just a second. So it's a little bit confusing. Each of these controls are context sensitive. They operate depending on what you are doing, what mode you're in, things of that nature. One of the coolest features about the D780 is the tilting touch screen. It's very useful. It's very good, very fast for navigating. Nikon has improved this over the years. They just get better and better. Very impressive. A couple other little side notes. This guy here on the top right of the eyepiece is called the diopter adjustment. So if you wear corrective eyewear like I do, and you're looking through the viewfinder, this is going to allow us to basically dial in the precise focus to match our corrective eyewear. This guy right here is the lock switch. And this is another question I get all the time, is that if you have this set up to prevent your camera from changing your focusing modes and you bump it to L, you're going to run into some focusing problems. I get a lot of emails about this. This is something else you should check if you're having autofocus, square problems and things of that nature. The idea of the lock feature is to set your camera up a certain way, and then to prevent bumpage, you would flip it over in this direction. Something else I didn't notice, and I haven't seen this on a Nikon camera before, is it's CHG, stands for charge. And there's a little lamp right here. What this allows us to do is that when we plug in our camera to the USB port into an outlet, this will indicate that we can charge our battery in camera. Sony cameras have been doing this for a while. I'm thrilled to see this on Nikon cameras. I typically prefer to have a battery charger But in the event I'm traveling really, really light and I don't want to bring a battery charger or I forget it, I can always charge the battery in camera. It's a really nice feature to polish it off. A couple other little things that I think you should know because you've invested a lot of money into this camera. So we have a buffer light right here that will indicate the camera is writing to the memory card. When you do high bursts, lots of images, this will stay on for a certain amount of time depending on how many images you took. You'll notice that we have a little green dot right next to the minus magnifying glass. And we also have a green dot up here next to the box that has a plus minus sign on it. The green dot stands for restoring your camera to the default settings. And this is different depending if you're on a photo mode or a video mode, but it resets the camera in case you've messed some settings up. You know, you don't really remember exactly what you did. And we have a similar feature here with the garbage can icon and this red that says format and the ISO button on top of the camera. And I'll demonstrate this when we talk about the top LCD, is that you push and hold the garbage can icon. And if you push and hold the ISO button and you hold those buttons down for 2 seconds, you'll be given an indicator. It'll say FOR, basically asking if you want to format the memory card. Push those buttons again and it should reformat your card. Make sure you have backups when you do this. And the 2-second hold also applies to the green dots. Before we get into some of this other discussion about the operation of the camera, I want to do an overview of the different types of information we are going to see on our screen and how to navigate some of those screens. If you don't have your camera, definitely get it and follow along. This is really going to kind of open it up and make it easier to get familiar with your camera. In toggle, just press this information button over and over and over again. And you're going to see that when we are in live view, so I'm pushing this LV button and we get this preview, I can toggle through different sets of information to be displayed. And something you'll notice is that there's some information that's absolutely not changing at all. And this information is classic, foundational. They're going to see it on just about every camera. It's here on the bottom of the screen. It's our shutter speed, which is the amount of time the sensor is going to be exposed to light, how long. It is given in a fraction, in this case, 1/50th of a second. So this is a critical component of controlling how much light is coming into your camera. This number, if you're not familiar, is the aperture. And the aperture tells us how large or small the opening of the lens is. We're controlling how much light is coming into the camera. If you do not have a foundation in photography, if this is new to you, I cannot stress how important it is to invest into a good course that will teach it to you. I have an hour crash course that will introduce you to the basics. It's included in the Nikon D780 Crash Course. There's a lot of value there, but it will teach you what these numbers mean when you're making them larger and smaller. We'll cover a little bit about this when we talk about exposure. In this number, this guy over here who's changing and bouncing around all over the place, this is our ISO. Think of ISO as a boost to the light that has been captured by the sensor. ISO does not control the amount of light. It is an electrical boost or a gain. It's an addition given on top of the light. And we'll have a brief discussion about this. Right now it's set to auto ISO, and we will change that when we get to the exposure lesson. There's a time and place for auto ISO, but I typically don't let my students start with it because it confuses the learning process. This here, you'll notice, is a metering mode. It matches the metering icon. And in the top left-hand corner, we have our shooting mode, which is going to match the icon on the top of the camera. We're in the P mode or the program mode right now. And you'll notice that as we push and rotate that, we get the other different modes. Something else you'll notice is that we have our battery icon, obviously. This little indicator here tells us when the camera is in focus. And it's in focus right now on the blinds. And I have it set to manual. And you'll notice that when I rotate it to the left and right, we get arrows telling us which direction to rotate in order to get in focus. But if you see that dot, you should be in focus depending on what the focusing square is covering. We also have this little I menu, this little information guy. And when we press that, we pull up a sub menu that we can navigate with our touch monitor. Very nice. We can navigate it with the directional pad. I think it's faster and easier just to touch on it and we can select something. This is something that's a little tricky, is that in some of the cases, it wants us to double tap before it changes. That can be very frustrating if you select something and you think you have it. It wants us to confirm it with an OK or a double tap. This is something that's going to take a little bit of time to get used to. We'll talk about this in a second. When we press the information button again, here we have our electronic level. And there's two levels in this. There's the side to side level. So if I was to take the camera and just kind of tilt it, you can see that it is yellow. It's telling us it's not even. And we also have the up and down, the forward and backward. And you can see it gives us this little yellow, it's like a square. It shows us where the plane is. So the idea on this is we do not want to see any yellow. We want to get everything all lined up, nice and even and straight. And when we do, everything will turn green. Very useful for landscape shooting if you're trying to get your camera set to the horizon. We also got an FX icon telling us that we're using all of the sensor, the full frame sensor. We have the number of shots remaining on our memory cards. And if we continue to press the info button, we get additional icons. So on the top here, we have two little cards with a little person. There's a white and a black figurine in them. This is our active D lighting. This will apply a contrast boost to our JPEGs, gives them a little bit crisper look. It applies only to JPEGs, not to RAW. And this off is telling us that this feature is not on. Picture controls are recipes for JPEGs. It's the instructions to the processor in terms of which colors to keep, which ones to throw away, and it allows us to tweak our JPEGs and videos in different ways. The A designates which of the picture controls we currently have. Next, we have our white balance, and we'll be talking about this in just a second. And the A next to this also designates the white balance that we're currently shooting in. The norm L refers to our quality. We'll be talking about this a little bit later on. I'm just trying to get through all these guys. This icon here, something I failed to do is the lens is on manual. So when I flip that switch forward, we get our auto focusing modes, and we also get the cluster being used, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So I've changed the focusing modes to demonstrate this touch guy right here. You'll notice as I toggle this little box, we have three different modes that control what happens when we touch the back monitor. So this guy, touch shutter with auto focus off, means it doesn't do anything. And this feature can drive me crazy sometimes. Touch shutter autofocus on means that it'll both focus and take the picture. This is really annoying, but sometimes when you're shooting landscape, it could be really useful just to touch on the screen and have the camera take the picture. Or, and this is the most useful one, we can touch to focus. We just touch on the screen and tell the camera where we want it to focus. Extremely handy. And with that in mind, I believe we've covered most of the information of the back monitor when we're toggling with the info button. There is something I want to point out is that when we flip over to video mode, you'll notice we get this crop that the top and the bottom parts of the screen are cut off. And this is to give us an aspect ratio for video shooting. It's normal. Don't freak out if you see this. Something you'll notice is that we gained a few new icons. I'm going to flip this over to manual because it's usually how I shoot with video. Whoa, what is this? That has to do with the LED lights that I'm using. When we use a very, very fast shutter speed, we'll get this phenomenon called banding. It's an artifact of the light you're shooting in, not so much the camera. So if you were to shoot with the shutter speed, in daylight, you wouldn't see this. And the way you fix this is you use a much longer shutter speed, usually around 1/250th of a second. It's going to disappear. I actually have a YouTube video that will explain why this happens. And it's a little dark, but we have auto ISO, so it's making changes for us. We'll talk about that in a second. In the video mode, you'll notice that we get audio levels for the left and right channel. And what we're looking for here is it doesn't turn red, doesn't clip out. That's bad when it turns red. We're losing audio signal. It'll give us an audio indicator. Now the microphone indicator right now says automatic. I'm not a huge fan of that. We're going to change it to manual. And when I do that, I will demonstrate why that is the case. But if you leave it on auto, the audio signals are going to be fluctuating up and down constantly. It's a nightmare. Some other features in here that you'll notice about video is that we get the resolution designated with 1080 here. And we also get the frame rate, in this case, 60 frames per second. We also have the current video record time. We're limited in the case of the D780 to 30 minutes. So when we start recording, we'll see this count down. That is an overview of the information screens. And with that, I want to get into the I screen, which allows us to have 12 different menu items maybe we don't want to go digging in the deep menu. Maybe we want to change some of these other icons we saw. I want to show how this works. You press your I button, and we have a lot of these same icons we've just been discussing. This is where you would change them. So if you wanted to change your picture control, which isn't something I would recommend for pure beginners, you can come in here and scroll through them, and it'll give you a preview as you're scrolling through. Some of them are kind of gimmicky, and I would never use them. In fact, most of the time, I don't really use these. I usually stick with, in some cases, portrait, some cases landscape. But for JPEG shooting stills, auto and standard are a good place to start. When you select the one you want, you can tap it again. When we're talking about image quality, this deals with whether we are recording a raw file, which is the original data captured by the camera. It's going to give you a ton more information for processing. So high-end landscape shooters and the sensors in Nikon cameras are phenomenal. They're among the very best. So if you're doing very serious high-end professional work, I would definitely recommend shooting in RAW. If you're taking a lot of images, like hundreds or thousands of images at an event, I would recommend shooting in JPEG. If you're just getting started and you want something to practice on, I think fine is acceptable, normal is acceptable, either one of these. In the case of shooting RAW and JPEG, we can also do that. And there are different ways we can set up our memory cards. So one would record RAW, one would record JPEG, or copies on both. It just really depends. But this is where we control the quality. And the trade-off on the JPEGs is that as you get to these lower files, so fine star to fine to normal, what happens is you get greater compression. And the compression is going to change the file size on our cards. So right now we're at 6.7K, right? So we come in here, we're on normal quality. If we come down to basic and we select that, tap the shutter button, we've doubled the number of images. I've done a lot of tests in the past. It's very difficult to see the difference between, let's say, fine and normal. Even if you print it up, most normal people cannot see it. So keep that in mind. But if you're really, really worried about this, I would just say start off on either one of these fines. It's going to be okay. It's a great camera, really high performing sensor. Worry about the technique if you're really stressing over it and not so much Photoshop and editing. So in the beginning, I think fine, if you're shooting JPEGs, is the way to go. If it's an image that you think you're going to want to keep or process, go for RAW. Interesting, there's no flash mode, there's no pop-up flash, but this is a way we can control the flash from the camera. There's a fill flash, red eye reduction, which is going to contract the pupil with a pre-flash. We also have a rear shutter curtain sync, which will fire the flash at the end of the exposure instead of the beginning, and then we can turn the flash off altogether. Again, this is dealing with a connected flash. Wi-Fi connection is going to come in when we're connecting to an app on our smartphone. It allows for remote shooting, and hopefully I can demonstrate this a little bit later. We have our focusing modes, very important. We have a negative digitizer, which is probably a feature most of us are not going to use, so we can customize this square to do something else if we're not a fan of it. We have our exposure preview. This is a nice thing to have in our camera. I think turning your exposure preview is a good idea, is to have this on, because it allows us to get a preview of how bright or how dark the image is going to be. Now, it's not working now because I'm on auto ISO and the ISO is changing it, but we'll talk about this a little bit later and we'll come back to exposure preview. Autofocus area mode deals with the focusing squares. I refer to them as clusters, and this allows us to control which cluster we are shooting with. Here's our active D lighting, different flavors. If you want a little contrast bump, you would probably go with normal. I usually have mine turned off because I do it to taste, even on JPEGs. Here we have our metering modes. So I'll be demonstrating this a little bit later. Here is the size of our image from large, medium, and small. And then we have our white balance. So many features to choose from, and I'll be giving a quick primer on this. We talk about it a little bit deeper on the crash course. The crash course deals with like the philosophy of use, and I get into the kind of the scientific ideas of what's going on in beginner language. So that's a lot of value that you would get in that lesson. In addition to all the screens I've shown you so far, there's actually another one because we're in live view. Oh, and by the way, when you go over to the video mode and we press our I button, you will notice that a couple of these guys have changed. Here we have our resolution and frame rate. So when we come in here, we can choose normal quality, high quality. In some cases, the camera is going to decide whether you're shooting in normal or high quality. So if you're doing something that requires a lot of data processing, it's usually going to default to normal. But the resolution is on the left and the frame rate is on the right. So as we scroll to the left, you can see that we get 4K options. We'll talk about this a little bit more during the video stuff. 24 frames, 25 frames, that's for Europe, the PAL standard. 30 frames is typically reserved for video shooting. If you're doing something for YouTube, it's pretty much accepted that most of it's 30 frames per second. 24 frames per second is what we see in Hollywood movies. So if you want to get that Hollywood movie look, you would go to 24. Continuing to go to the left, we're back at 1080 24. And there's also some high frame rate modes that we'll talk about a little bit later. We have wind noise reduction, again, our Wi-Fi, electronic vibration reduction, which I recommend keeping turned off. And the rest of these in here, you are already familiar with. In the menu section, we'll talk about customizing this to have the icons and controls that you want. So having said all that, there's so many different information screens. Just learning how to navigate them is confusing. So if you're feeling confused, this is why we're going through all the different sets of information. To exit live view, we'll press the live view button, and we want to see our shooting information display on the back. This is really useful for like astrophotography. We want to see our settings as we're shooting. We press the info button and we get the white information screen. We can also set this up to be a black information screen. But we see these familiar icons, the shooting mode. We have our shutter speed, aperture. We'll talk about exposure compensation. And we have our icons here on the bottom again. Something that's cool is we can change these by pressing the I button in either case. When it's highlighted, we can rotate directly through the sub menu. So there's a number of ways that we can change the settings, and that's great for ergonomics and usability because everybody has slightly different tastes depending on what they want and like. But the white information screen, very handy when shooting at night. We also have this normal, it's a vignette reduction icon. That means the JPEGs with wide angle lenses are going to be cleaned up just a little bit. And then we can change the timer on this so it won't shut off so fast. One of the icons in here that we haven't discussed is right here on the bottom. These are our custom controls. The custom controls allow us to customize certain buttons, and it gives us a map of the camera with a yellow highlight, the name, followed by the feature that we currently have. So that PV button in the front, if you didn't want to use it as a preview for depth of field, you could come in here and choose a number of options for that PV button. You can turn it into a focus button, focusing lock, all kinds of stuff. And the same is true for the FN button. We can choose a number of features, again, to customize it to tastes. We also have the autofocus on button right here, autofocus lock, auto exposure lock, the bracketing button, the video record button. We can customize this in different ways. Really nice. Real quick, I wanted to talk about the top LCD display. When we rotate the power switch, it's going to engage a light. We have our shutter speed, our aperture here at the top. These little dots are the exposure compensation indicator. Bottom left-hand corner, we have our metering mode and battery. We have our ISO indicator, which is set right now. This auto ISO indicator, which we're about to change, and it's set right now to 250. We have the number of shots remaining, and it also designates the memory cards. So number 1 and number 2 memory card, you can see that there's a little teeny tick mark, very difficult to see. Is telling us that it's writing to memory card number 1. I wanted to demonstrate the format feature holding the garbage can and the ISO button. So what does it say when we do this? So we're holding it for 2 seconds. It's giving us a format. So if I was to push the ISO and the garbage can button again, it would reformat my memory card. It's kind of a quick shortcut to do this. And we can also do this with the green dots. So we have the magnify zoom out in the exposure compensation button. When we push and hold for 2 seconds, it'll blink. And then we get our default restore depending on whether we're not in a stills mode or a video mode. So that is the top LCD information display. Another part of the touch navigation is that when we play an image back, we have the ability to pinch and zoom out. This is going to function very similar to how your smartphones would work. And if you continue to zoom out and keep going further, this is going to allow us to touch and drag through obviously a huge number of images if we wanted to do that, navigate in that way. Press play button, come back to our original picture. Before we get into the exposure in the mode lessons, there's a few things I want to point out. These are more secondary features, but you should definitely be aware of them. The first are the drive modes, and I briefly mentioned them a little bit earlier. It's this ring that goes around the base of the mode dial up here at the top of the camera. To change your release mode or your drive mode, we're going to push down, holding down, and we're going to rotate this little circular ring. So what do the release modes do? The release modes tell the camera what to do after we push the shutter button down all the way, and each of these letters and symbols mean different things. For example, S stands for single shot. If I push and hold the shutter button down, I get one single image. I'm holding it down, no additional images are being taken. Continuous, or C, means that as we hold the shutter button down, the camera will take additional images. CL, continuous low, means it's fewer frames per second. And when we go to continuous high, you can hear it's a lot faster. The continuous low and the continuous high, the maximum frames per second are going to change depending on whether you're in live view or using your optical viewfinder. Listen. Later on, when we're talking about the deep menu, there are some settings that will allow us to change the continuous low. But the maximum mechanical shutter that we can shoot is at 7 frames per second with continuous autofocus looking through the viewfinder. That's up from 6.5 on the Z750. If we shoot in the silent mode using the electronic shutter, we can get up to 12 frames per second. So continuous low is fewer frames per second. Continuous high is the maximum frames per second, depending on the mode we're shooting in. Q stands for quiet. Listen. It's important to note that this is not silent shooting. This is more of a quiet shoot. And I've always been curious about this because to me, I can't hear that much of a difference. Slightly. In the electronic mode, when we're not using any mechanical shutter, it's absolutely quiet, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Next, we have our timer mode. We push the shutter button down, the camera goes into a timer. Depending on how the timer is set up. Something you're going to notice is that when you use the timer, you'll get a little red indicator light next to the shutter release. It'll start flashing, and then right before it takes the shot, it'll have a solid red tone, and then it'll take the picture. A lot of these are going to be changed in the menu, and we'll talk about this a little bit later. Finally, we have mirror lockup, which means that we're going to flip the mirror up with the first shutter button depression. I think it wants me to do this out of live view, so listen. That raises the mirror up, and the second depression actually takes the picture. And the reason why you want to do this is to minimize vibration. So if you're shooting something that's super telephoto or maybe a really long exposure and you want to minimize vibration coming into the camera from the mirror flipping up, you would use mirror lockup. Some of you are going to be asking the question, why doesn't this work in live view? The truth of the matter is, in order for live view to work, we're looking through the lens and the sensor. The mirror is already locked up in live view, which is why it sounds basically the same. So this feature really is something that you're going to want to apply when you are shooting with the optical viewfinder. The mirror is already locked up in this position. So in any event, that is a quick overview of the release or the drive modes, which is what the camera does after we push the shutter button down all the way. Let's talk about white balance real quick. There's a short answer to this, which I'm going to give you now, and there's a longer answer I'm going to give you on the full crash course where I talk about the philosophy of use. In the beginning, as a pure beginner, don't worry about white balance too much. It essentially is how the camera processes the color of light that we are shooting in. So when we shoot indoors under light bulbs or outdoors under the sun, or if we're in the shade, those are 3 different types of colors of light. Our human eyes are really good at making these adjustments automatically. The sensor struggles a little bit more. And because of this, most modern cameras have the ability to change the color temperature that we're shooting in. The way we change it, obviously, we can see the white balance right here. We're going to push and hold down this question mark key icon button. And it's going to allow us to scroll through the different white balances. We can also press the I button and we can access our white balance in the bottom left-hand corner. This might be an easier way to see it. So we're going to change it in here. When we come into the white balance, you can see we get this menu and we get some arrows pointing to the left and right, which allows us to scroll with the directional pad. And you can see that as I'm shifting through these, the color of the monitor is changing. bluish, yellow, purplish, right? And there's a bunch of different symbols. A stands for automatic. So there's actually two different auto white balance modes. And in the beginning, I would just say leave it on automatic and shoot until you get comfortable with focusing, changing your exposure settings, getting used to the camera, adapting to different situations. And what will happen is you'll come to a point where the color, you'll notice it starts to look off. That's when you should start trying to adjust your white balance. Again, remember in raw photos, there's a lot more color information. It's a lot easier to fix raw photos in post processing, JPEG and video especially. A lot more important to get it right. You'll also notice that we have this little arrow that points down, and there's this detail thing. So if we push down, we have the ability to change the auto white balance from these different hues. Very difficult to even detect the difference, but it kind of tries to give you a definition about the differences between them. And then we have a natural light auto white balance. If you're shooting outdoors, this might be the better one to choose. And then when we push down, we get this little color gamut. This is a swatch that allows us to lean or shift the color hues in a different direction. So if we wanted it to be a little bit more blue, we could come over and you can see the color of the monitors changing. Or if I go to the right, it's changing. I only use this feature when I'm shooting video and I'm in controlled lighting conditions and it just looks a little off. I might shift it something like that or like that. Almost nothing. So for beginners in the beginning, I would say don't worry about the color gamut. What you should do is try to match up the icon for the shooting environment you're in. So if you're shooting outside on a sunny day, you would want the direct sunlight icon. If you're shooting under clouds, you would choose the cloud icon. If you're shooting in shade, you would select the shade icon. And then we've got incandescent light. You notice it's more blue. Fluorescent light's a little purplish. We have flash white balance. If you're using strobes as your primary light, you would choose that. And then we come down to these last two. One deals with Kelvin temperature, and the other one deals with preset manual. And I'm going to demonstrate the preset manual because I used it so much when I was shooting weddings. We'd be in mixed lighting conditions where we'd have some sunlight coming in, we'd be in shade, and there'd be some incandescent light. And so when you're shooting with heavy mixed light from different light sources, this is typically the better way to go. And I have white blind set up here, pure white. And what we're going to do is we're going to tell the camera that this is white, interpret this as white in the light that we're shooting in, and the camera will automatically make the adjustments. And so I push the measure feature, the data is acquired, and you can see that the hue has become more neutral. And hit done. And now I am in a preset manual white balance. Custom white balance is really what it is. We also have the ability to designate this at different positions. So we could have multiple white balances, up to 6 of them, and we could adjust them further with the gamut if we wanted to. I know it's a lot of information. The important thing to remember on this is the custom white balance from the blinds. You could use a white sheet of paper, a bride's dress, a ceiling, anything white or neutral will allow you to do this. The Kelvin temperature allows us to manually dial in something called a specific Kelvin temperature, which is how the lights are rated for different temperatures. For example, shooting outdoors on a sunny day, 5600 K. And that's just something that you learn, with more experience and time. You start memorizing, the different Kelvin temperatures. And there's a lot of philosophy of use that goes into this, and I can explain a lot of things. But what I want to demonstrate is that as I go lower to lower Kelvin temperatures, 2600 K, you can see the monitor is getting super blue. And as I go up, it gets super yellow. And the truth of the matter is the camera is doing the opposite of what these Kelvin temperatures are. So if you're shooting in candlelight, which is a very low Kelvin temperature, 2600 K, and you look at candlelight's very yellow, right? And so dialing in the 2600 K on the camera tells the camera to add blue to counteract the yellow and give us an overall natural hue. And the opposite's true when we go up very high, 10,000 K. We're seeing all this orange. Well, typically very hot Kelvin lights are blue. And so now the camera is adding this orange to counteract it, and that will give us an overall neutral hue. I know it's a lot of information. That's kind of more of the philosophy of use. That's the kind of stuff I talk about on the crash courses, is we get into this really heavy, okay, what's going on here? The takeaway message for you is if you are a pure beginner, shoot on auto white balance all the time. Okay, if you're just getting started. If you consider yourself an intermediate and you're comfortable with exposure and focusing, then you're going to want to change it to the icons as you're shooting to try to match it up and inspect your images, check the color. If you do a lot of video shooting, getting this dialed in correctly is going to be a lot more important because it's difficult to correct video when you don't have the raw information. Video is a form of JPEG, and because we don't have all the color information, it's super important to get it right in camera. So when I'm shooting video, I typically use the Kelvin preset. If I'm shooting in mixed lighting condition for video or stills, I use the custom preset manual white balance. I know it's a lot of information, but that is white balance. Next, we're going to talk about the shooting modes, the different modes there are and what they do. And I'm also going to show you some very basics of changing your shutter speed and aperture. You will definitely need to understand the basics of shutter speed and aperture to really take advantage of what a powerful camera this is. If you don't understand shutter speed and aperture, it's going to be really confusing. So the mode dial essentially tells the camera what to do, what to help us with. And so we have all these letters and icons, and I'm going to walk you through these real quick. This green mode here with the camera icon, and there's a matching icon, obviously, that's pointing to the tick mark. That tells the camera to do everything for us. I've always referred to this lovingly as the dummy mode. It turns your camera into a point and shoot. It really does pretty much everything for you, and there's very little that we can do aside from maybe focusing and taking the picture itself. When we come into the I menu, it's obviously going to give us all of these guys, but you can see so many of these are grayed out that we can't even access them. So think of the green mode as the dummy mode. That's not why you bought the camera. And we're going to rotate in the opposite direction because we have these U1 and U2 modes. And you can see there's a little U1 and a little U2 icon next to the P. So that U1 and U2 is a custom user mode. It allows us to set up the camera exactly the way we like it. And it remembers those settings every time we flip it to U1 or U2. Super useful if you're a sports shooter, for example, and you like your camera set up a very specific way. And this saves us from needing to go in and change all of those settings, right? If we push and hold down, then we come to the effects mode. You can see it's giving us this half circle shape, which is dealing with the back rotating wheel. And we can rotate through these different filters. I've never considered them to be, professional use. They're not something that I would ever use, and so I don't. I think it's really kind of a waste. You can take a look at them, play around with them, but if you're getting a camera of this nature, you're probably going to be doing those kinds of effects in Photoshop or after you've uploaded to your computer. This leaves us with the P, S, A, and M modes. These are the most important ones. If you don't have your camera, this would be the time to pause the video and go get it because this is going to be really important stuff. The easiest way for me to teach this is to start off in the A mode. I tell all of my students, struggle with A mode in the beginning because once you get it, you'll have it for the rest of your life. And I shoot most of the time on either aperture priority mode, A, or the M mode. I don't even hardly use the S mode at all. Occasionally, if I'm doing strobe work, I'll use P, like if I'm doing handheld flash work. All the other times, I'm using aperture priority mode. Now, there are a couple things we need to change in order for this to all make sense. And the first is that we are shooting in auto ISO. And for this lesson, I want you to turn it off. And by pressing and holding down the ISO button, and when you rotate the rear control wheel, you'll notice that we can change the limit of the auto ISO. This isn't what we want to do. We want to turn it off, so we're going to rotate the front dial. And that is going to make the auto part of it disappear. The second part of this, if you do not do it, this lesson is not going to make any sense at all, is we have to turn exposure preview on. And you can see right here, it's in the bottom right-hand corner of our I menu. It says EXP off. This needs to be turned on. So now that auto ISO is off and we have exposure preview turned on, this is going to give us a preview of how bright our image is going to be before we take the picture. So it's very important to get that brightness right before we push the shutter button down. It's a very powerful tool, and I recommend leaving it on almost all the time. The one instance you should turn this off is when you're doing lots of strobe work inside of a studio. There's some different rules that work with strobes. It can get really confusing in that the preview isn't metering the flash anyway, so it just makes sense to turn it off when we're using lots of strobes. Don't worry about that right now. So A mode, really, really straightforward, is I want you to start rotating the front control wheel. It's just below the shutter button. So I'm rotating this and you can see this F number is changing. Aperture priority mode means that we change the opening of the lens and the camera changes the shutter speed. The camera is making adjustments to the shutter speed to try to keep this as an even exposure. And that's what aperture priority mode does. That's the heart of the matter. The A means that we're changing the opening, and the camera will do the work of the shutter speed. When we take a look at shutter priority mode and we rotate the rear control wheel, you'll notice that the aperture starts changing. It's the opposite. So in shutter priority mode, S, we change the shutter speed and the camera changes the aperture. Pretty straightforward. In the P mode, when we rotate the rear control wheel, you'll notice that both sets are changing and neither of them have the box. And in the program mode, the camera is giving us different combinations. The program mode is sort of like the dummy mode. It's just taking some of the training wheels off. And when we come into the I menu, all of those grayed out features are now available. It gives us the ability to change, like our white balance or, things that we wouldn't be able to change in the dummy mode. In the manual mode, you'll notice that we have these highlights around both. The front control wheel will change the aperture and the rear control wheel will change the shutter speed. What this means is the camera is not helping us at all in manual mode. We just dial in the settings we want and away we go. So that is the difference between those four modes, and I recommend starting off in aperture priority mode. When we see the highlighted box, what this tells us is that we can change that setting using the touch screen, and it's also the setting that we can change rotating the appropriate control wheel, whether it's in the front or the back. This is basically telling us which one is active. A very important feature in this is the exposure compensation. It's probably one of the most important lessons I can teach you in this video, and it allows us to change the brightness of the image. It's right here on the top of the camera. It has a plus minus sign on it, little box. When you push and hold that down, we get this bracket on the right and this yellow indicator in the bottom. And when you rotate the rear control wheel, you can see the brightness changes starting to take place. So the short answer is that as you rotate this, you can make it brighter by making these tick marks go up on the plus indicator. And if you go in the opposite direction, it's going to make it darker. In an aperture priority mode, this feature is referred to as exposure compensation. So we can make the images brighter or darker depending on what we want to do. If you take a picture and it's too dark, you would come in and make it brighter. If it was too bright, you would go in the opposite direction. There's a much deeper answer that I will cover on the crash course that will give you the foundations of the philosophy of use as you are using the camera. Very important to keep an eye on your shutter speed when you are using aperture priority mode. If it gets longer or slower than 1/60th of a second, pictures are probably going to be blurry. It's one of the most common reasons pictures become blurry is you use a slow shutter speed, and beginners do this a lot when they're first getting started. So I always keep an eye on the shutter speed. I actually like it to be 1/100th of a second, even if I'm shooting people, they're sitting there and people move, the wind blows things and you move as you're holding the camera. So the faster the shutter speed, the better able you are going to be able to freeze the action. If you're shooting sports, 1/500th, maybe 1/1000th of a second. It really depends on what kind of subject you are photographing. So always sneak a peek at your shutter speed. Make sure it is minimum 1/60th of a second for handheld shooting, non-sports, probably 1/500th of a second if you're shooting sports. Something that's very confusing for beginners is the aperture number system. Smaller numbers mean wider. So if I go down to 2.8, I'm letting in more light. If I go in the opposite direction, let's say f9, it's a very small opening and it lets less light in. You can see the shutter speed is longer now. But again, check out that lesson on the full crash course where I talk about the philosophy of use. It'll be very informative. Something else I need to note, aperture priority mode, I use it probably 85% of the time, even for sports shooting, because it allows me to dial in the aperture that I want. In an outside, there's so much light that the camera is going to pick a faster shutter speed. So this is why I use it for shooting outdoors. Cloud comes overhead, gets a little darker, the camera will change the shutter speed again. So this is a very powerful tool even for sport shooting. When I shot weddings, we'd be in the church and in the lobby, and then we'd go outdoors. Those are three different lighting conditions, and the camera would make all those changes for me automatically. I didn't have to worry about it. If I have enough time, then I typically go to manual mode. This will be as good place as any to talk about ISO. We've turned it off from auto ISO. Now we're in manual ISO. ISO is a boost that we're adding to the light that the sensor captures. So the sensor is capturing light based on shutter speed and the size of the opening. It captures that light, and the ISO is an electronic boost or gain. The trade-off on ISOs is this. If you want to increase the boost to your images, you would increase your ISO number. There's a problem with it though, is it adds a lot of grain. I typically like to shoot at around ISO 400, sometimes ISO 800, occasionally 1600. I like to stay in those numbers because when you add lots of ISO, the images will get grainy. So let me demonstrate this. We're on a tripod, so we can use a longer shutter speed. I'm gonna take a picture. And when we look at that image in the playback, come in, you'll notice that the blind edges are nice and clean. They're sharp and crisp. There's no grain on the blind itself, right, at ISO 250. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the ISO button down and really turn it up. Let me give you a demonstration at 51,200. What we'll notice is that when we play it back, there's all kinds of problems with this image. Look how grainy it is. You can kind of see the noise grain. You can see that the edge of the blind is really struggling. And this is the trade-off with ISO, is that the higher that number goes, the more grain you are going to be adding to your images. If we come back and we look at the one that was at 250, zoom in all the way, take a look at that. Look how clean it is. Look how nice it is. And for that reason, it is preferable to use lower ISOs whenever possible. So what happened was I was shooting in a wedding for a friend as the second shooter, and I think I had my ISO at 100 or something, and we were in the chapel and it was really dark, and I was looking at my shutter speed. I'm like, that's a problem. So what did I do? I come in, I open my aperture up. It's still a problem, and I wanted it to be a faster shutter speed. So what did I do? I bumped up my ISO, and because we're adding this boost or this gain to this signal, the camera selects a faster shutter speed. So there's always this trade-off between the light that you're shooting in and the ISO that you're using. Let's take a look at shutter priority mode. S stands for shutter speed. We change the shutter speed of the camera, and the camera changes the aperture. Now let's say that we're doing sports shooting and we want to use the S mode. So let's say we're in a basketball game, it's indoors, there's not a lot of light, and we want to use a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. This is very common, as you'll see the aperture flashing. And what that means is the camera is not happy, basically saying, there's not enough light in here. I can't open wider than 2.8. And so having heard what you heard about my wedding experience, what would you do in this situation? I want you to think about it. If you said bump your ISO up, you are absolutely correct. So you can come in here, we can use the touch screen to do it. And at some point, what's going to happen is that flashing is going to stop. And so what the camera is now saying is that the added ISO is going to give us an even exposure at these settings, and then we can shoot. And so as a beginner, that's a really important thing to do, is to get used to changing your ISO. Keep an eye on your shutter speed, make sure it's fast enough for whatever you're shooting, and learn the balance between ISO and the light that you're shooting in. But I will cover this in great detail on the crash course. I will take you through the philosophy of use, and it will make a lot more sense. We can also change the brightness in shutter priority mode by using the exposure compensation button. Again, we can make it brighter or darker, depending on which direction of the scale we go in. And as I mentioned before, I don't really use shutter priority mode because I can do the same things in aperture priority mode, but that will take a little bit of time to get used to. Let's take a look at the program mode. In the program mode, we change the rear control wheel, and it gives us different combinations. It's one of those things that you could kind of play around if you're looking for a specific shutter speed. And I mentioned earlier, the only time I really use program mode is when I'm using handheld flash. I'll put a strobe unit on the camera and I'm shooting an event. It's really the only time I use it. Let's talk about manual mode. Manual mode is amazing because we determine the shutter speed and the aperture and the ISO in this case. And the camera doesn't do any changing for us. We simply dial in what we want and take the picture. There are no changes. In the manual mode, there is no such thing as exposure compensation, with one exception. This bar over here becomes a metering indicator. It's essentially telling us how bright or how dark the image is going to be. It's a little underexposed here. If I went with a longer shutter speed and let in more light, it would become brighter. And I love manual mode. It's just a matter of, do I have enough time to dial in these settings? If I'm doing running and gunning, I don't. You know, if I'm shooting a wedding event, I typically don't have time for a lot of manual, and I don't use it. If I have enough time, if I'm doing a professional shoot and if I'm doing strobe use, almost always using manual. So that's kind of the trade-off. But we dial in the aperture, we dial in the shutter speed, and we dial in the ISO, we take the picture. Now, there is one exception to this rule that I do recommend at some point you're going to come across, and that is indoor sports photography with changing lighting conditions, like MMA fighting, where you have all these lights that are coming on and going off. Certain indoor sporting events where you need a fast shutter speed and a certain aperture, that becomes very difficult to deal with because of the changing lighting conditions. So some pictures will be underexposed, some will be overexposed. And the workaround on that is to shoot in manual mode with auto ISO. So I'm pushing my ISO button down, I'm rotating the front control wheel to get back into auto ISO. And at this point, what's happening is we dial in the shutter speed and aperture as usual, but the camera will make adjustments to the ISO automatically. And it does it to compensate for these different lights coming on and off. I think in that kind of a situation, it's really handy. It's a really powerful tool. And when auto ISO is on, if we press the exposure compensation button and rotate the back wheel, now we have exposure compensation in a manual mode. That's kind of a new thing that we've seen in the past, maybe like 4 or 5 years is when this first came out. So manual mode does have an exposure compensation mode that works with auto ISO. It has to be turned on in order for it to work. And it's really great for situations where you need a specific shutter speed, a specific aperture, but you still have changing lighting conditions. So that is a quick introduction to the mode dial, changing our shutter speed and aperture in each of those modes. We've talked about the difference between regular ISO, high ISOs, and auto ISOs. We've talked about when I use the different shooting modes for different situations. That's just surface level. On the crash course, we will go into much deeper discussion of the philosophy of use and what the camera is doing. And it's a really great course, so definitely be sure to check that out. Something I've noticed about DSLRs is, as with time, they become more and more complex, and the D780 is loaded with different focusing features. There's different focusing modes, different clusters. There is different ways to focus depending on what we are doing. So if you're shooting a portrait, that's a very different skill set than shooting, for example, a landscape, or for sports, or if we're shooting video. And I go into each of these real world applications on the crash course again, but I'm going to give you some basics of focusing, how to get started, how it works, just a brief overview. There's a lot more real world application on the crash course. So the easiest way to understand this is to think of the camera in terms of the how, the when, and the where of focusing. How, when, and where. If you break it down that way, this is going to be easy. So we're in live view. If you're not in live view, make sure your live view is on. On the crash course, we will have an optical viewfinder lesson. It's similar, but it's a little bit different because we see focusing squares in real time, but the principles will still apply. How does the camera focus? We talked about it already. We're gonna take our finger and push the shutter button halfway down. When we do this, you can see that our focusing box turns green, depending on which one you have it set on, and pushing the shutter button down all the way takes the picture. So that's the first answer. How do we focus? With a halfway shutter button depression. Next, let's talk about the when, and this deals with the camera's focusing modes. It's the obscure little button on the side of the camera. It's inside of the lever on the front of the camera next to the lens. There's a button we're going to push into the camera body, and when we do that, you'll notice that we get this yellow highlight up here just below the viewfinder. Mine is set up to say AFS, And what I want you to do is to rotate your rear control wheel and see how it changes from S, A, and C. And we're going to talk about each of these real quick. Autofocus single, S, means that when we push the shutter button halfway down, the camera is going to attain a focusing lock. And as I am holding that shutter button halfway down, and if I move the camera, the focus will not change. No matter where I move the camera, the focus isn't changing at all. And when I push the shutter button down all the way, it takes the picture. So autofocus single is really handy for subjects that do not move. They're sitting still. Maybe you're shooting a landscape. Your subject is not moving. We get focus lock. And this technique of changing the framing is referred to as recomposing. It's handy when we're shooting with apertures that aren't like super wide, and that's a whole different discussion. Let's say you're taking a picture of a person and you want some of the background in it. You can move it this way and reframe it with apertures of around f4, f5, f5.6. It works. Doesn't really work with f2.8 or f1.8 because the depth of field is so shallow. That's a completely different topic. All I want you guys to know is that when you use AFS, you are getting a single focusing lock. AFC stands for autofocus continuous. And what this means is the camera is focusing over and over and over again. So we push that shutter button halfway down, the camera is updating its focus. You'll notice that the box doesn't turn green, but we can hear the lens working. This is going to be best for shooting sports, people who are moving, athletes, birds, maybe cars, anything that moves. You're going to want to be on AFC because that is a continuous focus that it keeps on refocusing. Even if the shutter button is halfway down, there's no lock. Push it down all the way, it's going to take the picture, and the camera is going to make the best prediction when the actual picture is taken. So AFC is better for moving subjects. And that is why we use the term when. It focuses once and locks, or it focuses many times over and over and over again. There was another one in here referred to as autofocus A, AFA, automatic. What this does is it gives permission to the camera to decide whether or not the subject is moving, when it would use AFC, or if the camera is still, it would use AFS. It turns a lot of the permission over to the camera. The truth of the matter is, in AFA, if I'm shooting a moving subject, I'm almost always on AFC. I just tell the camera, go with AFC, because if the subject stops, it's going to be close enough. That's just how I personally do it. For you, the take-home message is in the beginning, for still subjects, you're going to use AFS. For moving subjects, you're going to use AFC. You're always going to need to push this mode button down to change those focusing modes. If you don't want to change it that way, you can come into your I menu, AFS, and those three modes are here as well. So that is the when the camera is focusing. The where deals with the camera's focusing clusters. These are these little squares that we see, and we change which cluster we're using, again, by pushing this little button into the side of the camera and rotating the front control wheel. As we're rotating through them, you can see these little icons changing. We can also come into our I menu if we want to see what these different clusters are. I will walk you through each of these real quick. In the beginning, your camera probably came with audio area autofocus, and when we turn this one on, tap the shutter button. Kind of hard to see, but we have these little red squares, little corners. And what that is telling us is that the camera is going to be looking within this area for a subject of contrast, and it's going to focus on that. It's kind of like dummy autofocus, where the camera is going to make the decision for us. I rarely use it, almost never. There are a few key times we are going to want to do that, and I will point that out a little bit later. Let's take a look at some of the other clusters real quick. We can go with a wide area, which deals with a large box. It's something that I've been using. You can use the directional pad to change the position of that box. You can also touch on the monitor. I like having the touch autofocus, which is turned on. Different way we can focus by touching on the screen. Let's take a look at some of these other boxes. And this really deals with the sizes. So we had wide, large, and now we're dealing with wide area, small. And you'll see that the box is getting a little bit smaller. This allows us to be more precise with where we're shooting. We want to focus in a very specific location. I typically use this when I'm shooting landscapes. And then when I come into single point, you can see that the box is getting even smaller, even more precise. And then when we come into pinpoint, it's teeny tiny. This is going to be great for doing macro type photography. If you want to get really specific with where you're looking, you would use pinpoint. The clusters are the areas that we're telling the camera to focus specifically. It's going to be very useful, especially when you're shooting with very wide apertures or very shallow depths of field. That is a quick overview of using the focusing systems in live view. We talked about the how, the when, and the where the camera is focusing. There are many additional focusing techniques that I feel are worthwhile demonstrating, at least on the camera. I will show you how to do this with real world situations. It's a little bit different in practice depending on your subject, but one of the questions I always get is about back button focus. How do you use the AF on button to focus? It's set up to go, but the question what they're really asking is how do we disengage focus from the halfway shutter button depression? Because sports shooters, they love to shoot with the thumb focusing and then the index finger to actually take the shot. So we want to remove the autofocus here. And that is going to be done in the deep menu. I'll be going through this a little bit later on in this lesson. But what we want to do is turn off AF activation for the shutter button. And it says AF on only. What this does, and the reason why you want to do this as a sports shooter, is this designates focus and this designates the shooting. With the halfway shutter button depression, sometimes you'll have an athlete moving. Let's say this is an athlete that's just stopped and you're going to be getting focus, 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 and you want to recompose it. When you release your thumb off the AF on button, the focus won't change and you can fire away without needing to change the focusing square. It's one of these nuances of sports shooting. It's really useful. If you change this from your halfway shutter button depression and you're not used to it, and you forget about it and you start shooting, you're going to think your camera's broken. So always remember, if you try it out and you don't like it, to come back and turn that on. Second, very important thing I need to show you about focusing, you can see I put a picture of myself up here to act as a model, is face detection. Really powerful. And the confusing thing about this is it's only going to work with the wide zone. So what we're going to do is come in and I'm pushing the mode dial button on the side of the camera. And I'm going to rotate my focusing square to the entire screen, the autofocus auto area. So if we come in to our focusing clusters, it's this one in the bottom right. And when you start shooting people in this mode, if it's set up correctly in the menu, you're going to get this little yellow box over one of their eyes. This is super powerful when you're shooting wide open. Let's say you're shooting at like 1.4 or 1.8, even 2.8. You have a very shallow depth of field, and we want to get the eye in focus. So now we have eye detection. We also have face detection. We can determine in the menus how this works. So to find it, you're going to come in to the custom setting menu. It's A5 and face and eye detection on. And so when you're shooting a portrait and you want the camera just to lock in onto that eye, it is a great feature. And the arrow is telling us we can choose which eye we want. There's another great focusing technique that I want to point out. It's one of these things that's going to make more sense when I show it to you in a real world shooting situation. But this is the manual zoom focus technique. So what I'm doing, you hear me doing, is I'm turning my lens on and off. So I'm turning it to manual focus. We can also turn the camera to manual focus with our auto focus mode selector switch. So I'm reaching around the camera in the front and I'm flipping that to M. And when we do that, if we press the zoom button, this is the manual zoom focus technique. And then go to our manual zoom ring, we can dial in focus tack sharp, something I use all the time when I'm shooting for video. When I set this up and I'm recording this, I use this technique all the time. Very helpful to know how to do that. We can tap the shutter button to take the picture. We can also push on the zoom out magnify glass, see what we're shooting. There's another feature I want to show you that you're going to find in shooting in display. And if you come down to peaking highlights, this is going to give us an overlay when it is turned on. I'm going to turn it to high and I'm going to turn it on red. We have these different colors: red, yellow, blue, white. I think red is the easiest one to see. And now what you can see is this red highlight. Zoom in a little bit. What's happening with peaking is the camera is defining where there is a high degree of contrast, and it should be in focus there. So let's take a look here at my focus target. It's a little plus sign, and we're zoomed in as close as we can go. And the thought on it is, well, let's just zoom in. And you'll notice that as you zoom in, we lose the peaking. The way this works, so the only way you're going to see it is when you're in manual focus, zoomed out. Otherwise, you're not going to see it. So don't freak out if you don't see it. If I come back up and I turn the camera to autofocus manual, it disappears. Focus peaking is for manual when we have the full screen. I'm going to flip this over to video mode, and then I'm going to flip peaking on, and there it is again. So I'm focusing the autofocus switch to manual, and we get the peaking again. I want to demonstrate a couple other focusing techniques. When I'm shooting at 60 frames per second, I like to double my frame rate to the shutter speed. So if this is 60, I'm at 1/20th. If I'm shooting at 30, this would be 1/60th. And I'm going to set up a target or two, and I want to show you some focusing techniques for video. Let's talk about focusing in video. So make sure you're in the video icon for video recording. And much of the same techniques apply is that we have our autofocus single, we have autofocus continuous, and autofocus full time, which means that the camera is going to be making some decisions about whether it's using a single focus or a tracking type of focus. I prefer to kind of hang between these two, autofocus single and autofocus continuous, when I am using focusing for video. And there's a number of techniques you should be aware of. For example, we have all this information. Want it to disappear so you guys can see this. I have a yellow box on my face because I'm using that full autofocus area, and it's using face detection. So if I don't like that, I would need to come in to my clusters and just pick a square. So we're going to do that. Tap the shutter button. So now I just have this square that I can touch on the camera and designate where I want the box to be looking. Is it here or is it here? Tap the shutter button halfway down and the camera should get locked. I think I'm a little bit too close. If you saw what was happening, I was a little bit too close physically. I had to actually move the camera back a little bit, and that happens sometimes. Lenses have a limit unless you're using a macro lens. When I have this box set up the way I'm demonstrating autofocus single, I'm touching on whatever I want to focus, and the camera just stays there. In the past, you would have to get some gear wheels and another person to help you do this, first AC, whose job it is to change the focusing point. And this eliminates so much of that hassle, is that as a single videographer, you can go out and just touch on whatever it is you want to focus on. Very powerful. Pulling focus with the touch monitor, and I'll be demonstrating more about this in the video section of the crash course. Let's talk about autofocus continuous in video mode. Now, there's something very subtle about this, is that when you choose a square, it doesn't do anything. So it looks like. And what it wants you to do is either double tap or engage the autofocus button. And you're basically saying, focus continually in this position over and over again. And when you lift it up, it's not going to change anything. And the difference between that and then when we come into the autofocus full time is we're telling the camera to track automatically. And so I want to demonstrate this using my hand. If I come out here, my hand, the camera is focusing on it. And so when I'm changing the position, the camera is looking where this square is. Put it right here. And it's making those changes all by itself. So when we're shooting on the gimbal that I'll demonstrate in the crash course, you'll see how the camera will be able to change its focusing position when I have a subject that's moving or walking. So if you're doing, tracking shots and you want the camera just to do its own thing, designated by the square, that's the one you're going to want to use. When you get really close to the camera, it doesn't like it as much. And we even have, if I'm not mistaken, a very small single point. There it is. If you want to be a little bit more precise. So those are the three focusing modes in changing the clusters in video. If you wanted to go back to face detection, remember it's going to be on this one right here. We just got to make sure it's turned on. There we go. Another feature in here in the autofocus area mode is that we have the ability to choose a tracking point. The way the tracking works, so we have this little white box here, and when I hit OK, the idea is when the camera goes to yellow, is it's going to track that subject. It's going to work better when we have clean backgrounds and our subject has some contrast, an edge, something with bright and dark. If I were to reset this and put it on, let's say these blinds back here, not as much contrast there, and that's going to be easier to trick. Camera doesn't really know what to focus on. If I put it on, that's thinking it's face detection, but if I go on the corner here, let's try one more time. So white box allows us to select where we're going to put this guy. Zoom in a little bit. Try to put it on the edge there. It has improved greatly over the years. When this first came out in the earlier Nikon cameras, didn't work very well. It was constantly dropping focus. So the algorithm has changed over the years and it's greatly improved. But we will be talking about how to apply the different focusing techniques from touchscreen pull to peaking, why you would want to use one focusing square in sports shooting versus a different for 3 different kinds of video. There's a lot of information on focusing on the crash course. Real quick, I wanted to talk about the metering modes and how they work. In the beginning, it's not going to be too important to you, but as you progress and get more advanced, it's something you should definitely be aware of. The metering modes are designated with this little target icon, and so when we want to access them, the shortcut is to press and hold, and we get these little icons popping up that we can scroll through. There's 4 of them. And in the beginning, the matrix metering mode is going to be pretty much the one you're going to have. It's like an automatic version of metering. That breaks up the screen into different patterns, and it's measuring light and color, and it's making suggestions to the camera based on the information that's coming into the camera. It's looking at the light, saying, hey, this is what the exposure setting should be. The easiest way for me to demonstrate this is to talk about the spot metering mode. You're going to see this rear control wheel, and I'm going to change it to spot metering. The spot metering mode essentially tells the camera to look where our focusing square is, and I've chosen one of the smaller focusing squares. And I have a headlamp here that's turned on. So it's a brighter light than the rest of the area. And what you'll notice is that when I'm moving the square around the light, the shutter speed pretty much stays the same. We're in aperture and priority mode, which is what the camera changes the shutter speed. It's making suggestions. The moment we move that square over the bright light, look what happens. The camera starts to suggest a much faster shutter speed. So what's happening here is the camera is making shutter speed suggestions based on a pattern of light that it detects specifically around the focusing square when we are using the spot metering mode. And when I move that focusing square off of the light, it's sampling the light on the blinds, and it's not as bright, and it's saying, hey, use a slower shutter speed. But when it sees that bright light, it's like, whoa, Nelly, it's way too bright here. We need a faster shutter speed. And that is what's happening. Most of the time, you're going to use that matrix metering mode. If I'm shooting somebody with heavy backlight and I don't want the camera to be looking at the corners, I'll use the spot metering mode because that's what I want the camera to be exposed for. So this is only going to really help you on the P, S, or A modes. In the manual mode, you really don't have metering. It's you determine the shutter speed and aperture. But let's take a look at some of these other ones in here real quick. We also have the center weighted metering mode, which is sort of like evaluated, but it puts more emphasis on the middle of the viewfinder. You see, it didn't really change a whole lot. Almost nothing changed. And then the last one is the highlight weighted metering, where it looks in the frame and it's averaging from the brightest with its surrounding. It's another type of average, and you can see it used a slightly faster shutter speed. But the short answer on this is in the beginning, you're going to be going with matrix metering mode or occasionally the spot metering mode. Let's take a look at the deep menu system. This is going to be a brief overview. There's a ton of information, and there's going to be some things we're going to skip. But on the full crash course, I go through everything in pretty deep detail. The navigation of the menu systems by Nikon cameras in the past few years has greatly improved. It's on par with Canon, which I think between Canon and Nikon, they're the best. Using the touch monitor, you can scroll through pages and you can tell there's multiple pages by this bar. If you see this bar over here, that means you got more than one page. See it over there. And you'll notice that as I'm staying on the first tab, I can scroll through it and it doesn't go to the other tabs. So on the far left, we have all these different tabs that we can navigate by touching directly. And another thing is you'll notice that there's a color and there's a trim to it. It's a little line here. And when we scroll to the right and we're not highlighted onto the tab, we can see the color of the original tab. So they all have different colors. Blue is for playback, green is for still photo shooting, and then there's a different green for movie shooting. We have the red customization setting menu. We have the orange setup menu. We have the retouch menu, and then we have the gray, which is the custom or my menu. And another thing I want to point out is that you can also push to the right on your directional pad. When you're selecting something, keep pushing to the right. Sometimes you'll push to the right to turn things on, but obviously the yellow is where we currently are. When we touch on the monitor, it opens up that menu item. So for me personally, I love to do everything by touching on the monitor. Garbage can icon, obviously we're going to delete images. The playback folder that we're looking at, right now I have it set to all. I think that makes sense. If you create other folders, you can come in here and look at individual folders of images. The playback display options is going to be off by default, and I think it makes some sense to turn these guys on because when you play the image back, when you want to see additional information, such as shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO, we can push up. We can see the date and time, the name of the file, the resolution, and we can get some more information by pushing up, right? So the way this works is that you can determine the types of information you want displayed by toggling up in the playback options. So if we wanted to see the focus point, I'm pushing to the right to select it. If we want to see the highlights and the history, we'll just turn them all on, right? The overview, we're going to hit OK. Tap the shutter button, come back out. And now we get a tremendous amount of information that we can determine how much of it, even the focusing point now. So the ones I typically keep are the exposure information, shooting data, overview. It's asking if I want to save them. Yes, I do. And those are my playback options. So we have the ability to copy images from one memory card to another. We can select the card we want to start with, whether it's slot 1 or slot 2. We can come in and select the images. In this case, we'll just choose all of them. Yes. Then we can select the destination folder. And I've not set up a folder on this card, but we can throw it in the D850 folder. And then when I hit copy images and I hit yes, it would transfer those images to the second memory card. So if you're on a shoot and you're not doing backups and you realize, hey, I want to save these, this is how you would do it. Just copying them over to the other memory card. Now I have a complete backup. Okay. Image review. Do you want the images to play after you shoot? Sometimes when you're doing sport shooting, you don't want the images playing back, or if you want, just stay in the action. If you do, you'd come and turn this on. After you delete an image, what do you want the camera to do? To show the previous, the next one, or to continue as before? I recommend leaving rotate tall on. It means when you're rotating the camera in the portrait orientation, it'll automatically rotate the image. We can play a slideshow from our camera using an HDMI cable into a monitor. And the idea is that you can determine, how long do you want these images to show? Maybe 5 seconds. You can pick whether it's stills or images or maybe just the rating, depending on what you're doing. We used to do this at weddings. And when you hit start, the camera will start playing these images. It's kind of a fun feature if you're on vacation or if you are doing a wedding and you want to, preview some of the shots you've taken. Pretty nice little cool feature. And then we have the ability to give images a rating. So the way this works, you'll see right here, we have the checkerboard in the set. So we need to push and hold the checkerboard button down and push up or down, and it gives it a star rating between 1 and 5. The cool thing about this is the star rating should be respected by Lightroom or, your Bridge application. So when you pull them into those programs, they'll have a star rating already. And that's the blue menu, pretty quick and easy. Now we're getting into the still shooting menu, and this allows us to control things like which card we're writing to, the file, the storage number, things of that nature. We can reset the shooting menu. This is just for the stills. And we can also determine the storage folder. So previously, when we were doing the copying, we were looking for a folder, and this allows us to come in and create a new folder. Just come in, call it this 105, okay. And that is going to create a new folder. We can also select different folders. So if you have one shoot in the morning and another in the afternoon, and you maybe want to add another one to another folder, you would come in here and select that previous folder. File naming means that we can change up to 3 letters. In the first part of the file, you'll notice the file naming is a little different depending on the color gamut we're using. It's just 3 letters for sRGB, which is what I recommend unless you're shooting for a magazine. So we can come in here and change those 3 letters. Pretty straightforward. The role played by the card in slot 2. We can have this set up for overflow, which means I'm going to shoot on card 1, and when it fills up, it's going to go to card 2. We could have them mirroring each other, which means that they'll just have a copy of a file on each memory card. And then we can also designate for raw images to go into slot 1 and JPEGs to go to slot 2. It really depends on how you're shooting. I am comfortable shooting to a single card slot because I'm not doing weddings anymore. I used to do weddings, but if I was doing weddings and I was worried about a memory card failing, then yeah, you should absolutely shoot with one of these other 2 options. So mirrored images, or if you're shooting raw, it might make sense to have a different card with JPEGs. It's really personal preference, up to you. Image area. It's asking how much of the sensor do you want to use? And I recommend leaving this on FX, that's the full frame. We can also go shoot into a crop mode. There are certain times that photographers shoot in DX mode. And in Canon cameras, you can't shoot in crop mode with a full frame camera. You can use DX lenses on our full frame camera body. Just know that the image circle is going to be smaller on the sensor, and you'll get heavy vignetting in the corners. I'm sure there's a reason out there that some photographers want to shoot in DX mode. Maybe they only have a DX lens, and this is where you would change it. We can also come in and select at a 1:1 ratio in a 16:9, which is more cinematic look. But when we're shooting stills, I always recommend FX because you can crop it out later. Auto DX crop essentially means that if you put a DX lens on here, the camera will recognize it and flip it over to DX mode. Makes sense to have that turned on. I like turning this on because it automatically tells me if I'm in DX mode. When you look through the viewfinder, it'll be grayed out around the border. So when you're in the DX mode, you will see it. If you're in FX mode, you will not see that. Image quality deals with compression. Compression is essentially how much data the processor is going to throw away. And we have many variations of JPEG, from JPEG fine with a star, fine without a star, normal, and basic with stars. Basically means that we're telling, as we go down on this list, we're telling the camera to throw away more information. Essentially, the take-home message on this is that JPEG fine are going to be larger in file size, and JPEG basic are going to have they're going to have more compression. There's more data that's thrown away. And in the testing that I've done in the past, it's very difficult to see this with the naked eye unless you're printing up very large prints. If you're nervous about this and you're just getting started, JPEG fine will be great to start. If you're just practicing and learning, how to use the camera. If you're doing professional type of work, I recommend shooting in RAW. RAW files contain a lot more data. We can do a lot more processing. And in the case of RAW plus JPEG, we can save both of those file types. Image size, I always recommend shooting on large. And the reason is it's very easy to take a large image and go down in size. When we use something like small, for example, we're telling the camera to take that full resolution and make that resolution much smaller, 6 megapixels. It's throwing away all kinds of information. It's resizing it in camera. And if you have a small image, it's a lot harder to go up in size, and with still retaining that resolution and detail. When we're talking about the raw recording, this is asking for the quality of the raw files that we're shooting. My recommendation is to leave it on lossless compressed. Basically means that we're getting the data, all of the data, the raw file, and it is without loss. If you go with compressed, it's a slightly smaller file size, and I haven't seen it yet on the D780, but on other cameras, I have seen artifacts when you get into the pixel peeping, is that some compressed raw files kind of fall apart. And I can't say that, I'm not saying that about the D780, but the short answer is 14-bit lossless compressed is going to be your highest quality raw file. So you can see the bar over here. I know I have a couple more pages, and I love to just touch and drag. I think that's the easiest way to go. We have our ISO sensitivity settings. We can change the ISO sensitivity by itself in the menu. I think it's better to do it from the button, personally. We can turn on our auto ISO in the menu, and then it's asking what is the maximum ISO setting that you want when we use auto ISO. 51,200 is a pretty high ISO rating. Anything higher than that, it's really useless. You really can't use it. In fact, probably 25,600 or even less than that is that when you get into these higher ISOs, it just becomes really grainy and the processor tries to smooth it out and it looks really weird. The minimum shutter speed when we're using auto ISO, we can come in and tell the camera the longest shutter speed to use. If it's not on auto, so if we're shooting, you know, handheld, we may want to come in and say, hey, don't use a shutter speed slower than 1/100th of a second, and the camera would respect that. But for now, I'm going to turn auto ISO off. I think that's a good way for beginners to go. White balance we talked about. This is a different way we can select it in the deep menu. It's all similar to what we've covered already. We have our picture controls. Again, from our deep menu, we can choose these. And another part of this is we see the flat, which is really popular for videographers, but we can push to the right and make adjustments to the picture controls. So if we wanted to add some sharpening, there's different levels of sharpening: quick sharpening, mid-range sharpening. We have clarity, contrast, brightness, saturation, and hue. And the short answer on this is if you are first getting started, this is if you're still beginning and learning, don't even worry about these things. Really, these are settings for more professional photographers that want a specific look of JPEG coming out of the camera. And the truth of the matter is, if it's an important shoot, a lot of times you're shooting raw, but if you want to process your JPEGs in a specific way, this is where you would do it. The idea is that portrait, for example, would have more accurate flesh tones. Landscape would have more vivid, skies, blues, greens, things of that nature. In the beginning, auto or standard is going to be fine. Manage picture control allows you to create your own custom picture controls, your own recipes. And it's basically asking, what's your starting point? Well, we'll start with portrait. And if we wanted to add sharpness to portraits, like a quick sharpening, you'll notice that when I push right, it's adding it to all of these other three variables. And you can come in here, create your own picture style, whatever it is, hit OK. And it's going to ask, where do you want the camera to remember this? Put it at C1. And we can name it, hit OK, and it's saved. So now that we've set that up, you could go down and scroll through all these, but if you go the shortcut, it's going to be right there. So this allows us to create our own custom picture controls. Color space should be sRGB unless you are shooting for a magazine and you are familiar with the Adobe RGB gamut. sRGB is where you're going to stay. Active D lighting is a contrast bump to our JPEGs. Normal's fine if you just want a little bit of contrast added to your JPEGs. I think it's looks pretty good. Long exposure noise reduction is anything over a second. The camera is going to apply a filter that would help reduce some of those noise if you turn that on. Anything over a second. The problem with it is it takes a little bit more time to process. And then we have our high ISO noise reduction, which deals with very high ISOs. Definitely recommend leaving this on normal. The camera will clean up some of that noise. It does make a difference, in my opinion. Vignette control. Vignette control, I recommend leaving it on N for normal. Vignetting is a darkening you'll see in the corners when you use certain wide angle lenses. Diffraction compensation deals with when we're stopping our aperture down to be very small, like around f11, f13, we start to get something called diffraction, which is a softening of the image. There's a video I made about the physics of diffraction, and there are a lot of camera companies that are now putting diffraction compensation into their cameras that allow the cameras to clean it up, sharpen it up just a little bit. Uh, I feel like it's kind of a good idea. You know, the main thing is that you're aware of what's diffraction is and when it starts happening. But if you turn this on, this will apply to your JPEGs. Auto distortion control deals with bowing, a pin cushioning that sometimes we'll see with wide angle lenses, and this will also allow it to be cleaned up. More important to do this for video. In fact, all of these guys, because video is a lot harder to clean up than still images. With video, we're dealing with 24 or 30 or 60 frames per second. And when the camera is moving around, that can really kind of be not a simple thing to clean up in post-production. Flicker reduction deals with certain types of fluorescent or mercury or sodium based lamps that are not on constantly. They're actually flickering. And when you do a series of images like on a high burst, you'll see the exposure and the color changing between each shot. So when you turn this feature on, the camera has the ability to recognize when this is happening, and it will actually take the shot between the flickers to try to get it right. So if we turn this on, we would see it, we'd get the warning indicator in the viewfinder. Some people don't like the indicator. I think it's a good idea for if you have flicker on to see it, so you'll know why your camera might be hesitating a little bit. But if you don't want it on, you can come in here and turn this off. The flash control we'll talk about on the crash course. There's like a 45 to 50-minute lesson where I give you an introduction to flash photography, the strobe I use, the off camera flash. I like the Godox series. It's pretty affordable. You can get a nice basic setup for about $110 for the flash, about 60 for the transmitter. And with one flash, you can do quite a bit, but that's covered on the crash course. The bracketing, I'll give you a demonstration on the crash course. A bunch of these guys here. Bracketing basically tells the camera to change a setting between shots. And when we come in, we can choose between exposure with flash, or exposure only, flash only. We can have the camera change the white balance and also the active delighting between each shot. So basically, we choose the bracket type we want, come in and we tell it how many frames, that's what F stands for. And then we can also determine the increment between those frames. And in this case, there would be 5 images with 2 stops between each. When I would hit OK, we could come out, take the images. So once bracketing is on, we can do it in live view. So we get our bracketing indicator here. And what you'll notice is the camera will be changing the shutter speed between each shot. For the sake of time, I'm going to flip this guy. It's having a hard time focusing. So the camera is automatically changing the shutter speed to give us different exposures. This is very popular among landscape photographers shooting in very high dynamic range situations where you might have a bright sun and some dark shadows. And they'll take those images and they'll combine them together in Photoshop and create a high dynamic range image. And there's a feature on the D780 that will do it automatically, which is just right here. I'm going to come in here and turn this off. When we get back down to 0 frames, we're good to go. So the shortcut for this is the bracketing button on, it's just above the white dot next to the lens release. If you push that, you can come into your bracketing and you'll see the dials. Here's the front dial, here's the back dial. So I can determine the number of frames. I can determine the number of stops between them. And that is the shortcut way to do it. I think it's faster. Multiple exposure mode. This is one of the lessons we cover on the crash course. It essentially allows us to take multiple images and stack them on top of each other in real time. So I take a picture of a tree, and then that tree would be displayed in live view, like an outline of it. And I could take a picture of a person, and it would blend the tree and the person together. It's a fun mode. I don't think it's a serious tool because you can do it in Photoshop, but I will demonstrate how to use this on the crash course. It's a fun thing to try out. HDR, or high dynamic range, means the camera is going to take multiple images, stack them together, and give us a final product in camera. So it's doing all the steps of Photoshop for us. So we come into HDR mode, We can turn it on for a series. We can select how strong we want this to be, high, extra high, auto. And I think this is really important. It's a great feature to save the individual files. So the raw images, which is awesome, because what happens is when you start to get motion with HDR. So let's say I'm out at the beach, and I'll demonstrate this also on the crash course. I'll show you an example of how to use it. The problem is that you got waves, you got trees moving, and so sometimes the HDR feature gets this ghosting effect in the images, and it kind of ruins the image. And so there are times you want those backup files. Now, having said this, the HDR feature can absolutely save you. I think it's really good on Nikon cameras. Just try to hold the camera as still as possible because moving subjects tend to mess it up. Definitely something to be aware of, because if you don't have a tripod and you're trying to get that shot, this could be your best bet. Interval timer shooting and time-lapse movie. Those are two different things. They sound similar. The interval timer shooting allows us to tell the camera to shoot at different intervals. We're basically telling, hey, start at this time and this date. I want you to take a picture every 1 minute. And I want you to do this for 101 shots. And you'll notice something that's cool here is it gives us the end date and time depending on when we start. So 4:36, right? So if I come in here, let's see if we can make this work. Hit OK. So the end time would be 6:16. The start time would be 4:36. And so we would know it's, hey, just under 2 hours of shooting if we're doing one shot every minute. I also like exposure smoothing, and depending on what I'm shooting, I'll turn silent photography off. It's usually okay to shoot with the shutter. So just keep in mind that the silent interval is going to be electronic shutter. Time-lapse movie is a little bit different than interval timer shooting. Interval timing is dealing with full resolution images, and you're just getting stills, whereas time-lapse movie is putting a movie together. And I will demonstrate this again, the difference between these two, and we can pick an interval, the shooting time, all these things. The difference is we're going to end up with a movie file on this one. Focused shift shooting, I will give a demonstration of this on the crash course. It's very useful for macro photographers when we're dealing with a very shallow depth of field. And the way it works is we designate a number of shots. These units, these focus step widths are kind of arbitrary, but we're going to tell it to change the focusing point for the number of shots over an area, and the camera would automatically take those images. Now, the reason why this is important is because when macro photographers are shooting itsy bitsy spiders, for example, they want to have a really sharp image. And if you use an aperture smaller than, let's say, f8 or f11, we start to get into softness issues. So the technique is to really take multiple images at different focus positions, import them into Photoshop, and put them together. That's how it's been done in the past. And we'll cover all of this on the crash course. I'll give you a demonstration and show you how to do it. It's a cool feature. I think it's great. And then finally, we have the silent live view photography. This is, you'll notice SL on. So when we turn this on and we come back to live view and we want to shoot, listen to the camera here. No sound whatsoever. Very useful when shooting on movie sets, which I've done. They're recording audio, they want it quiet, and you want to take pictures of the action, right? Well, you can't have a shutter making noise, and the same is true with certain churches for weddings. There are some things you should be aware of with electronic shutter. I want you to see the image that I took. There it is. And when you see this, you're going to be going like, what in the world is going on? This is one of the drawbacks of electronic shutter, is that when you shoot in LED lights like I am now, we get this banding. There's a video I made on it explaining why this happens, and it's because I'm using a faster shutter speed. But if I change my shutter speed, let's say to 1/125th, it should be all but eliminated. It should almost all be gone. Might have a little teeny bit left. No, can't really see it. It's a lot to go into in terms of why this happens. At 1/60th, we should see it just a touch. There it is. You can see it just a little bit. So if you see that and you want to eliminate it, you got to shoot at 1 125th of a second, usually in the United States, or slower, or change your lighting. Another problem with electronic shutter shooting is if you pan, sometimes you'll get the jello effect where vertical things will be bent in different directions. So I'm going to turn that off, and that is the still shooting mode on the D780, the green tab. And we're coming into the light green tab, which is the movie shooting menu. There are many things in here that are exactly the same as the still shooting menu, so I'm not going to spend any time on this. Instead, I'm going to point out the most important things in this menu that you need to know as a beginning or intermediate photographer. So movie shooting menu right off the bat, destination, when we come in here, it'll actually give us the amount of space that we can record video files depending on the setting that we're currently using. Image area, again, similar to what we looked at previously. Frame size and frame rate are pretty important when it comes to video. If you're shooting something that you know you're going to publish, you should always be aware of, is this, are we going for a film-like look? Are we going to post this on YouTube? That is going to allow us to determine our frames per second, which is this number over here on the far right, 60 frames per second, 100 frames per second, 120 frames per second. Typically, film is 24 frames per second. What you see in the movie theater, 25 frames per second is the PAL standard in Europe. And then video standard in the United States is 30 frames per second. So very important to keep these in mind. And these other numbers here deal with the resolution. 3,840 pixels wide by 2,160 pixels tall. That is 4K. It's not exactly 4,000 pixels wide, but it's close enough. So if you wanted to shoot 4K video for YouTube, would be the setting you would choose. If you wanted to do a short film, probably want to go with 24. Then we have HD, which is standard high definition. And you'll notice that at 120 frames per second, that's a lot more frames. And so the idea is that when you shoot at 120 frames per second and you play it back at 30 frames per second, it's going to be 4 times as slow. So you can get the slow motion effect. And I will be demonstrating this on the crash course as well, give you some examples and some techniques in terms of how to shoot it, following a moving person on a gimbal, for example. We'll do all that fun stuff. These guys down here allow us to play back in slow motion so we can see it, how it looks, when we're playing back. Otherwise, we're just going to record it. But yes, definitely keep in mind what you are intending for the video, because that's going to allow us to choose which of these resolutions and frame rates we want. Movie quality, by default, it's going to be set to high. If you wanted not so great a quality, you can come down. The difference is going to be the bit rate at which this is being recorded. It's going to not use as much memory when we're on normal. Really depends on what you're doing. I always record on MOV because I'm going to edit it. If you know you're not going to edit and you want to upload it straight to the internet, you would choose MP4. We have our ISO sensitivity settings for movie shooting. White balance, picture controls. The high-end videographers definitely do a lot of customizations. They like to pretty much start off with a flat profile and tweak it and turn all the contrast and color down. And they typically like to add that back in post. It's a lot of work, in my opinion. I personally try to get the video right in camera. The most critical thing when you are getting started is your white balance. Try to get your white balance right in camera. And then as you get more experience, you may want to come in and start tweaking some of these picture controls. We got active de-lighting, noise reduction, very important for video. We have all the other stuff we talked about. And then down here, we have something called electronic vibration reduction. Some people love this. I personally am not a huge fan of it, because what the camera does is that when you're recording video, is it crops in and it stabilizes the image. So the philosophy on this is lower quality video where you're losing some resolution is typically better than overly shaky video. The truth of the matter is you can stabilize it in post if you have an editor who knows what he's doing. It's not that hard. And so I personally leave this turned off. Optical stabilization is a little bit different in that we're dealing with stabilization in either the lenses or in an IBIS, which we do not have on this camera. IBIS is internal body image stabilization. Electronic is more of a software approach to the same problem. Microphone sensitivity is something I would definitely recommend coming in and turning to manual. And the reason is you'll notice that we have these channel indicators left and right here on the bottom. So we're recording in stereo, and you'll notice that very loud noises create this red indicator on the far right. That's telling you that the audio has clipped out and we've lost some of the audio signal. So the manual setting allows us to turn this down. And as I snap my fingers, you can see it's just barely getting into that range where we're losing the audio signal, and I would hit OK there. If you leave this on auto, what happens is there's this fluctuation between speaking and not speaking. So when it's silent, the camera is bumping up the gain. And then when you start talking, you clip out and then it turns it down. So there's this constant fluctuation of sound. I never use the auto sensitivity. It's always on manual. You can also turn it off if you want. Very important to keep that in mind, and very important to keep an eye on your levels as you're recording. You're definitely going to want to get an external microphone because as you're handling the body, those vibrations carry over to the microphone on the camera, and it just doesn't sound good. So in the past, I recommended a Rode microphone, $200 or $300, and I don't recommend it anymore. I actually sell my recommended microphone to beginning videographers, and the reason is many of them don't know how serious they're going to get about this, and the microphone performs awesome. If you're just dipping your toe in the water, start off with a high quality, smaller microphone. Try it out. If you're not happy with the audio quality, which you probably will be, then you would upgrade and you can spend thousands of dollars on microphone equipment, no problem. But start off small, try it out, see if you like it, and I'll put that link in the description. The attenuator is more of a dampener. It kind of prevents you from clipping out your audio. If you want to turn it on, my recommendation is any serious feature on your camera, you should test it out. But I usually leave mine turned off. In the frequency response, I have it on the wide range. If you wanted to limit it to just the vocal range, you would come down and select it here. But for a beginner, just leave it on wide. Noise wind reduction. I've never seen this successfully work on any camera. And the idea is that when it's very windy outside, you can turn this on and it would prevent that wind noise. The way to do this is with something called a dead cat. It's this little furry sleeve that goes on your microphone. We've included it in the Maven mini mic kit. Put it on there, and what happens is when the wind hits that furry ball, those individual hairs absorb the wind, and that reduces the sound of the wind noise coming into the mic. That's the way to do it. This feature I typically leave turned off. Headphone microphone. We have a headphone jack on the side of the camera. I use my wired iPhone earbuds, plug them in there, and yeah, this controls the volume. And then we can determine the time code. If you're just getting started, don't worry about it. So this is the HDMI stuff, which basically allows us to record to an HDMI recorder. There's a lot to go into, ProRes and different codecs and things of that nature. If you want to record with time codes, you can turn this on. You can also turn it on for HDMI. Once this is turned on, we can go with different methods, free run versus record run. Record run is typically what you are going to be used to, is that when you're recording, the time code will start and stop. Free run means it's constantly running, synced with the clock of the camera. Some of this is starting to get kind of complex, but this is where we turn on our time code. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the video deep menu tab, the lighter green. Now we're coming into the red menu, which is the custom setting menu. And you'll notice that in here we have subset menus designated by different color. A, red is autofocus. Yellow, B is metering and exposure. We have our timers and auto exposure lock, shooting and display, bracketing and flash, custom controls, and our movie. And when you go through this red tab, you'll notice those colors changing as we come into it. So you can see all the red followed by the yellow, green, and blue. And the idea is to try to categorize those menu items so you know, hey, the red is for focusing. So when we have the camera set to autofocus continuous, this feature allows us to tell the camera should it be primarily towards taking the picture, which is release, or should it be primarily towards focusing. In the past, when I tell the camera to go focus, we lose our maximum frames per second. And Nikon cameras are pretty accurate when we're shooting sports, for example. So I leave it on release personally. In an autofocus single, I tend to leave it on focus. So these are default, they make sense. So we have focus tracking with lock on is that we can determine how fast this lock on is changing and moving. In the beginning, the default is fine. So if you want to use that tracking feature and you want it to be faster, you can turn it up, but it might also miss. It might also kind of slip off of your target. It's one of those things that you're going to find out, depending on the subject matter you're shooting. So this is grayed out 3D tracking face detection. This is something that is going to work through the viewfinder. So we can't see it in live view. The idea of this is that when we're on our autofocus area mode, we come in here and we select this guy, the one that uses face detection, and we go into our optical focusing through the viewfinder. What we are doing is we're turning over the ability to select focusing squares to the camera. See, it's turned on now. And there's some good things about this, and there's some bad things about this. In the past, when I've seen this on other cameras, what happens is there's an algorithm scanning for what it thinks is a face. And so you can have vegetation in the background, and if it has a matching pattern, it'll focus on the vegetation. So the short answer on this is that I turn this off. And I use, just the focusing squares if I'm shooting sports and things of that nature. 3D tracking is really designed to track a single moving face, because if you have multiple faces, which one is it going to lock onto? And it's not as polished. It's not completely going to do what you want it to do. And for that reason, I recommend turning it off. That is a very different story than when we're dealing with face or eye detection in a portrait setting where we might have one person and we can use the back monitor and we know exactly what we're focusing on. This is a powerful tool. The auto area, auto face detection, you can choose eyes. I like eyes because if I shoot wide open, we're going to have that tack sharp focus on an eyeball, right? But we can go with face detection only, or we can turn it off as well. I leave mine here. Focusing points used in the optical viewfinder. You can designate it to be every other point if you don't want to scroll through all those focusing squares. Sometimes that's what people like. I leave mine on all for now. And we can also store the focusing points by orientation. That means when we're holding the camera horizontally, we may have a focusing square over here. And then when we rotate it into the portrait orientation, we may use a different focusing square. And what this tells the camera to do is to remember those focusing squares as we're turning the camera between those two orientations. I think it's a good feature. I'll just turn it on. Autofocus activation, this deals with the shutter button. Do you want the shutter button to focus with that halfway depression? It's pretty good for beginners to learn that, I think. And then the focus point wraparound is something else I turn on. It's in the viewfinder. When you move a focusing square over to the right, if you go continuously to the right, it'll jump around. Same thing with top to bottom in different directions. It just saves you from having to scroll through all these points to go back. You can just jump from side to side around that way. Focus point options. A lot of this is preference. We get a red overlay in certain dark conditions, and that's what the illumination is. If you turn it on, it'll always be on. Auto will allow the camera to determine when it's going to kick on or not. These last two deal with if we want to see different focusing squares, for example, when we're using manual focus. If you want to see the focusing square, so if we go to manual, we'd still see the autofocus squares. Sometimes that can be confusing, so if you want to turn that off, you can. The dynamic area autofocus assist, I think this is a good idea to leave on. You're going to see these as little dots around the clusters of squares. So the 9 square cluster, for example, you'll see a square and you'll see these little dots around it. And this allows us to kind of keep track of how big our focusing cluster is. And for that reason, I recommend leaving it on. Low light autofocus basically allows us to tell the camera that we're shooting in live view stills mode and we're having a hard time focusing, this is supposed to help us focus more accurately in low light. And then we come in to the metering and exposure stuff. Most of this I leave it on by default. Third stop increments make pretty good sense to me. Easy exposure compensation, I leave this turned off. Use the method that I demonstrated by pushing the button down and holding it. This kind of confuses it a little bit by just having a different wheel to turn. Matrix metering allows us to determine whether or not we have a face detection. And the reason why this is great is because we're telling the camera to say, hey, look for a face in here. And if you see a face, set the exposure settings to that. I think when you're first getting started, it can be really useful. So we'll leave it there. We can determine the area of the center weighted metering mode, probably a little bit too much for most beginning and intermediate photographers. So we're going to leave it at 12 millimeters. And then we can come in and mess with the fine tuning of the exposure. And I do not recommend this. If you are a pro and you know what you're doing and you want to tweak how the camera measures light and what its recommended settings are, you would come in here and play with this. But for beginners, absolutely not. If we wanted to lock exposure with the halfway shutter button depression, we can come in here and turn this on, or we can lock exposure when we're actually shooting. I leave it turned off by default. The standby timer of the camera itself, you can see we have tons of these different timers depending on when you want the camera to turn off. I'm teaching right now, so maybe we'll have it at 5 minutes. And then the self timer deals with the mode timer up here. By default, it's set to 10 seconds. If that's too long, we can go for 5 or 2 seconds. We can even go longer to 20 seconds. The number of shots is great because if you're doing a family portrait and you want it to take multiple images instead of running back to the camera every time, you could just come up here and say 6 images, and the camera will take all of those images at the end of the timer. And we can also change how much time between each of those shots, up to 2 or 3 seconds. Really great feature. Monitor off delay allows us to determine when certain monitor features turn off. So for all these different power saving features, we can determine how long and at what point it'll turn off. Now we're getting into the shooting in display. When you remember us talking about the continuous low burst, I said we can shoot at fewer than 7 frames per second. This allows us to come in and determine the exact frames per second of the CL release. So the idea behind this is that if you put your camera into your camera bag and you are on a high burst and the button is pressed against the bag, it'll shut off after 100 shots. And we've seen this on the D500. I think it's 200 shots on the D500. But if you want it less than that, you can come in here and turn this down. The synchronization release mode allows us to take multiple cameras and have a master so the cameras are synchronizing as they shoot, probably beyond the scope of this video. Exposure mode delay, I recommend leaving to off. If you want the camera to wait before the image actually takes, you can put a slight delay in there. Electronic front curtain shutter is in the Q modes. We're basically having the first curtain be electronic, and it's a little bit more quiet, but it can also help reduce some of this motion blur. Extended shutter speeds in manual mode allow us to shoot up to 900 seconds. So if you want that option for a very long exposure, you would turn this on. File number sequence, when it's turned on, and that's what I recommend, is that when we change our memory cards or create a new folder, is the file numbers will be sequential. If this is turned off, it is going to reset every time we create a new folder or change the memory card. And this manual reset would start over when we come in here and select this. When we're shooting in the effects mode, do you want the camera to save an unaffected image? So if you're playing with those modes and you want to have one with the effect and one without, you would turn this to on. Otherwise, you're just going to get the effects. Exposure preview is something we've talked about. I think it's a good idea to leave it on with the exception of when we are shooting in strobes. We can have a framing grid display. When we turn this on, we will get a grid overlay in our live view. You can see it here. Kind of have a pretty fast shutter speed. Let me open this up so we can see it a little better. This is going to allow us to frame up with architecture, maybe help with our horizon, things of that nature. Peaking highlights we've talked about. That's the overlay when we're doing manual focusing. We have LCD illumination, which talks about this top LCD dial. I like the off. It basically means when I rotate the dial to the light bulb, it turns on. If you turn it on, it'll be on most of the time. The exception is when you're shooting, and then when you stop shooting, it'll turn back on again. So this is kind of a battery saving feature to leave it off. Live view in continuous mode is when we're doing a burst. You want the live view monitor to turn off. If you leave it on, it'll stay on, and I think that makes more sense for me. When we're talking about the flash sync speed and the flash shutter speed, the easiest way to think of these is the fastest and the slowest shutter speeds when we are using a flash, and by default, these are good settings. If we try to use faster shutter speeds with a flash over 1/200th of a second, you'll get a clipping out. And when you're hand holding a flash, if we're using a slower shutter speed, we'll get some blurry artifacts and things of that nature. It's a lot to go into, but the short answer is leave them where they are. Exposure compensation for flash, it's asking when we make the image brighter with the flash, do you want it to apply to both the flash and the ambient light, or the ambient light only? And I will demonstrate how to control those on the crash course. I'll show you a really easy way to have complete control over how bright your flash versus how bright the background is. Auto flash ISO sensitivity control. Kind of tricky how this is worded. Essentially, it's asking is that when we have auto ISO turned on, do you want it to apply to the flash as well as the background, or just the flash? I would say leave it here for now. The modeling flash is activated when we press the PV button. The PV button is located on the front of the camera, about where our right index finger would rest. And it will make the strobe give a pulsating light. And the idea is that it will allow us to visualize where light is falling on our model. So sometimes when you bump it, you're like, oh, what's going on? That's the modeling flash. Bracketing order allows us to change the order of our bracketing. For example, MTR is an even exposure metered. So an even exposure, an underexposure, and an overexposure, or we can go underexposure, even exposure, overexposure in that order. So it changes the order of the bracketing images. Now we're coming into the customization of controls. It's asking when we are using the I button, how do you want to see these guys lined up? So this is where we customize the I menu. Very nice, because you're going to be using some features more than others. And so you can change this up. If you didn't want to have, let's say, your image area, you can come in here and choose from a whole list of options. I love that they did this because it increases the usability experience of the shooter. You're going to prefer some things over others. Then we can change the I menu when live view is activated. So we have two different instances of the I menu when we're shooting with the information panel, that white or black screen, or when we're in live view. Then we can customize certain buttons. I believe I demonstrated this already. We get a little orange indicator. It's really yellow. So this gives us a yellow indicator of which button we're customizing. We can come in and change what that button does if we want to. What does the OK button do? Well, in these different instances, so we're using the viewfinder, pushing into the camera body will reset the focusing square to the center. But if we don't want to do that, we could change it to highlight the active focus point. In live view, what does it do? Well, we can zoom in or out, or we can select the center focusing point, which I like. And then when we're in playback mode, what do you want it to do? Well, we can view histograms. That's kind of cool. Or choose a different folder. Just really depends on what you want. And now we can customize the command dials, which is how these front and rear wheels rotate. We can change the rotation direction. We can change which one is the primary or the sub dial. I recommend leaving this the way it is, because otherwise, if you change it and you come back and watch this video, some of the things may not make sense when we're talking about the exposure lesson, for example. Release button to use dial, it's a little confusing, but basically this means when we're changing our ISO, for example, the way it's set up is we push and hold on the ISO button and then we rotate the wheel. Release button to use dial means we would push and let go of the button and then change the setting and push it again. I kind of like it the way it is now. It's just easier to deal with. So this is push and hold, right? And this is push and release. So Once this is set up, we push the ISO button, release it, change it, and then we push it again. I think this is too many button presses. I kind of like the release method more. Reverse indicators deal with the exposure compensation indicator. You'll see it in the viewfinder. You'll see it on the side of the screen, and this just flips which side the plus and negative side are on. The light bulb switch on the power switch is that when we turn that to the light bulb, what do we want to see? Do you just want to see the LCD backlight, or do you also want to see the information display on the back monitor? Kind of nice, right? Let's leave it there for now. And then we start getting into the movie customization controls. So we can customize the eye menu for video. Resolution's here. It says quality, but it's really resolution. Great, again, if you like to shoot a certain way. We can customize the controls for video shooting. So here they are, different buttons, customizations for video shooting. We can change the autofocus speed when we're in video mode. So if it's not fast enough, we can turn it up, or if you want to slow it down, you can. I would definitely recommend doing a test shoot if it's important in figuring out, depending on your subject matter, to slow it down or speed it up. Autofocus tracking sensitivity. So when the subject moves, how fast do you want the camera to recognize this? Again. And then we have our highlight display, also known as zebras. So if we turn this on and we come in and let's just bump the ISO up to see this thing. You can kind of see these diagonals. It tells videographers that the image is overexposed. So that is the red tab. We've gone through all those custom controls, and now we're getting into the orange tab, which is the camera setup. Formatting our memory card will clear everything off of it, including protected images. And the logic on this is always make sure you have at least 2 copies of your images before you reformat your memory card. So at that point, you would have 3, including the memory card. I back up onto a hard drive. I also upload online into a cloud. And I also send a copy to my assistant who backs it up on his computer. So I usually have 2 or 3 copies minimum for everything that I shoot. And you'll have to develop your own workflow. I talk about it on the crash course, and I'll give you some ideas and some guidelines that will help you. A lot of people don't know this, but Amazon Prime has a free cloud storage system, including RAW files, and you can back up your images on Amazon Prime, believe it or not. But always, always, always have 2 copies. I can tell you horror stories of a family losing a hard drive. One of my best friends, they lost years of their children's images because they only had 1 hard drive and they didn't back it up. So back up your images, and when you're ready to do your next shoot, come in and you're going to select which memory card you want. And then it's going to ask you sure you want to do this? And I don't want to do this right now. So we're going to say no. You would wipe the memory card clean. And so just get into this habit of doing it after you've downloaded and backed up your images. User settings deal with the U1 and the U2 mode dials up here. So once we set the camera up the way we like it, we come into save user settings. We can save it to U1, save the settings. And so every time I flip to that U1 switch, it will start off with those settings. So if you do sports shooting or portrait shooting, or maybe you do underwater photography, some very specific white balance settings, for example, you can set those up the way you like them and then flip to the dial and not have to dial in all those settings. We can reset the user settings here. Pretty straightforward. Language, different languages, only 4. Hopefully you are an English speaker if you're watching this video. Time zone and date you saw when you first set up your camera. We can set the time zone. I'm in the Hawaii time zone. We don't have daylight savings here, believe it or not. Pretty interesting, huh? We can change the date and time, the format. There's the daylight savings. Monitor brightness. I actually turned it down a little bit into this video because it was too bright. If you're outside and you're shooting and it's harder to see, you might want to come in here and turn it way up. Just depends on what you're doing. We can change the color balance of our back monitor. We have a virtual horizon. This is the electronic level, which we can access by toggling the info button. Information display, I kind of leave this on auto. When it's set to auto, the camera will basically update it what it thinks is best. But if you want to determine whether it's dark on light or light on dark, you can do so here. Basically, whether you got a black screen or a white screen for the information display on the monitor. I'll show it to you real quick. It is this guy right here. Autofocus fine tuning options, I would say definitely don't mess with it. It'll allow us to change the focus, the forward or the back focus of our lenses. This works better with certain types of softwares where it can go through. One's made by Recan, pretty impressive. It'll help you fine tune your lenses. But in the beginning, I would say don't worry about this unless you notice your lenses are missing focus a lot. For non CPU chip lenses, you could designate the number of the lens and tell it what the millimeter and the aperture are, and it allows the camera to keep track of what kind of lens this is. The clean image sensor feature means that we can designate whether this works now, turn it on now, as well as when we clean the camera up, when we turn the camera on, or when we turn it off. This allows us to do this and control when it happens. It's a little membrane that fits over the sensor itself that vibrates and it kicks sensor dust off. And for most cases, it's pretty great and amazing. However, you are going to get some stubborn dust specks on your sensor. You will notice it when you stop your aperture down to like f13 and you take a picture of the sky. You'll see these specks. They'll be on every single image. And on the crash course, I will teach you how to clean your sensor so you don't have to pay a camera store or send it into Nikon. Now, when you read the manual, Nikon says, we recommend that you only send it in to us. They don't want anybody else cleaning it. I clean all my own cameras. Camera stores clean them. Professionals clean them. If you know what you're doing, you're going to be fine. If these are grayed out, it means your battery doesn't have enough charge. It wants you to have enough charge for the mirror to be locked up as you're cleaning. Same with some of these other pixel mapping and things of that nature. So the lockup mirror for cleaning allows us to flip the mirror up and get access to the sensor. There are a number of tools that I use. They're relatively inexpensive. And if you can learn how to clean your camera one time, that will pay for the cost of the crash course. It's basically going to cover the cost of it. Just that one lesson. Image dust off reference photo is something I just skip. This is a software solution to removing sensor dust from multiple images. I have never used it in all of my shooting of 17 years. I've never used this feature on any camera. Pixel mapping essentially resets the sensor. If you have dead pixels, you'll notice it either as a red or a white speck. You'll see it on your images. If you come in here and select pixel mapping, it will reset the sensor and it usually fixes it. I have had to do this a couple times in the past. Image comment and the copyright are very similar. They allow us to attach certain information into the EXIF data of the image. We can control our beep options depending on how loud, the pitch of the volume. We have our touch controls. I definitely recommend leaving it on. There are some other options here for playback only and disable. The HDMI stuff, this really deals with running a video signal out through an HDMI cable, either into a television or a recorder. For most of us, it's going to be on auto. If you're recording to an external monitor, you might want to come in and set something specific, depending on the abilities of your monitor. And there are some advanced features in here as well. You'll notice that we can output to 10-bit for those of you who are video recorders. It's very exciting. I'll try to have a lesson on the Atomos Ninja 5 and how it's set up on the crash course so you can see how this is done. So in order for location data to work, we have to connect the camera to either a smartphone or a GPS module that connects to the camera. Nikon has a couple of them. Be sure to read up on compatibility so you get one that works. And the idea of this module is that it will embed the GPS locations into the images where you take the pictures. It's really handy. There have been applications where I have needed this. You know, I'm doing disaster aid work and I'm taking pictures and it would reference the exact location beyond the scope of this video. Powerful tool if you need it. So we have a wireless remote. It's grayed out because we're not connected, and we have some options to change how that remote operates with the FN button. So it has its own function button. And then we have the options for the remote itself. Airplane mode is exactly what it sounds like. It's putting our camera into a safe mode, much like what we would do with a smartphone. And hopefully, if I have enough time, this is why one of the reasons I'm trying to get through this is I want to show you how to connect with our camera to the SnapBridge app. Sometimes it drives me crazy. And similarly, we can also connect to a PC. There's the WT7 wireless transmitter. We have some conformity markings, battery info. The battery info will tell us the percentage of the battery charge, the number of shots we've had on this charge, as well as the age. As we use and recharge the batteries, they start to lose, the number of shots we can take, and they kind of die faster. Empty slot release lock. This means we can take an actuation without recording to the memory card. It confuses some people because they think there's internal memory, which there isn't. And so in order to record a picture, you got to have a memory card in it. We can also save our menu settings. All these settings that we've changed in the menu, we can save them to a memory card and transfer them by memory card into another camera. That's where this happens. We'd come in here, we'd save the settings, take the card out, putting it into another D780, and we could load those same settings onto a second camera. Very useful for wedding photographers or anybody, sports photographers, people who are using multiple cameras. And we can also reset all of the camera setup settings. Finally, we have our firmware. Very common for Nikon to issue a firmware update within a couple months of the camera's release. There's always some kind of little bug or something that needs to be fixed. And we can see that this is version 1.00. Nikon will announce it. They'll say, hey, version 1.1 is available. And then you would know it's time to update it. And there's a pretty simple process to doing this where we'd install the firmware onto a memory card, put it into the camera, update the camera, and that is usually described in the same location where you download the firmware update. And it'll tell you what firmware changes have happened. So that's the camera setup menu. Now we're coming into the retouch menu, and for the sake of time, I'm pretty much going to skip this. The short answer is it allows you to do some very light editing within the camera, and these editing items are listed and described, so we can do raw processing, we can trim the image, resize it, active de-lighting, we can do some retouch, eye correction, distortion. It's kind of fun. I prefer, obviously, to do this on a big monitor where I can see all the pixels and know exactly what I'm dealing with. But if you have nothing else and you're trying to, get this from your camera to your phone and you need to change the perspective control, for example, it's nice to have the tool there. You can do some light video editing if you want to. And the retouch menu is something I almost never use on Nikon cameras, but it's there if you need it. My favorite menu is this last one right here. My menu is a customizable menu that will allow you to add the menu items you use the most. There's actually two different variants of this. There's the My menu, and there is also recent settings. Recent settings is a little bit different in that the camera remembers the last menu item that you accessed. And so after you use your camera for a couple days, the items that you used most recently will be at the top. And so if you're using the same ones over and over again, you'll have this tab that is going to show you the last used settings. My menu is different in that we can select the items that we want. So let's say we want to go with, I don't know, format our memory card. That's something we want to have in, our My Menu tab. And there you can see we've added it. Let's go to shooting and we'll go to image quality, for example, just as an example. There it is. So now that I've added those two items, here they are. And this allows us to access those things that we want. We've gone through probably over 100 different menu items. And now we don't have to search the menus each time we want them. We can just come in, we can remove them. We can change their order if we wanted to. So if we take this guy, we can move him down and they swap. And again, we also have the ability to go to the most recent. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a brief overview of the deep menu systems on the Nikon D780. For some of those high-end features that we covered briefly, such as the focus stacking, HDR, time-lapse, things of that nature, I will cover those in full detail on the crash course. Real quick, I wanted to give you a basic overview of connecting with Wi-Fi to your smartphone. It'll be similar if you're on an Android. I have an iPhone 10. you're going to need to download the app called SnapBridge from Nikon. I have a love-hate relationship with this app. In the past, it has really given me some headaches because of its inconsistency. It's improved over time. It still has some bugs. It's not perfect, but let me show you how to set it up. We're going to come into the deep menu. We're going to come to the orange tab, which is the camera settings, and we're going to select Connect to Smart Device. I've had some problems with Bluetooth pairing, so we're going to go with Wi-Fi. Establish a Wi-Fi connection. What this is doing is it's turning the Wi-Fi signal on in the camera, and it's giving us the name of the identification of the camera. And we're going to go into our Wi-Fi settings on our smartphone and look to see if we can see that. So I'm in the Wi-Fi settings. As you can guess, is Michael the Maven. It's my home Wi-Fi. We're going to turn that off and turn it back on just to refresh it. There's the camera, and it's asking for the password. So the password is Nikon D780. There's some history behind this, is that there was another Nikon camera in the past that didn't have an ability to password protect, and it was very easy to jump on to other people's cameras, and they kind of got in trouble for it, but they've fixed it. So now there's a password. If there is somebody else that has the SnapBridge app and they see and they try to jump on my camera, I can change the password. There's a way to do this in the connection settings, where I can come in here and change it. I'm not going to do that right now. So just keep that in mind. That is something we can swap up if we need to. But once we're connected, we're going to go back to the app. We're going to open up our SnapBridge. The cool thing about SnapBridge is that you can have multiple Nikon camera bodies remembered by the same app. It does a pretty good job of doing that, I think. It recognizes the different types of cameras. In my opinion, the most useful part of this app is remote photography. So when we select this, we now have a remote view. It's like a remote live view of the camera. And you should be able to touch. I'm in the autofocus area zone right now. It should allow you to touch in different places of the viewfinder and allow us to change where focus is. We can take a picture by pushing the shutter button down here. To just point out some of the features in here real quick, we have our shutter speed, our aperture. We can come in and change these. It's very nice to be able to do this remotely. The distance it works is about 25 or 30 feet tops without anything in between. We can change our shutter speed. We can change our exposure compensation if we want to make it brighter or darker. If we're on some of the other modes like program, aperture priority, shutter priority, I'm on manual right here. You can see it. This is nice. It allows us to change which mode we're shooting in. Didn't see that on past Nikon cameras, even though the dial is pointed to M. We have the ability to change our ISO. We can change our white balance. We have some settings in here. Basically, when we download images, do you want it to be 2 megapixels or the full size image? 2 megapixels is fine for posting things online. We can go with a self timer. We turn that on. We can choose 3, 5, or 10 seconds. Let's turn that off. Live view is something definitely I recommend because it can allow us to preview the shot. You can see that the downloaded images here are going to be 2 megapixels, the number of shots remaining on the memory card, our battery life. And this is a nice, easy way to do remote shooting. We get a preview of the shot. Really great for stills. You'll notice that we can also go over to the video mode. The selected mode is not available. What's going on here? Let's go to manual. So we can go to manual mode. Oh, it's basically saying that there's no aperture priority mode in video shooting when you're using the app. There it goes. So sometimes this will happen, is that you'll think you have it and it wants you to actually touch on it. So when we get our camera settings set up the way we want, the white balance looks a little off, yeah? We can start and stop video recording. It's giving us a preview of the time we have left. This is something I use on the crash course to show you how to film yourself. If you're shooting with another person, there's a way to do it using the app, and you can stop video recording here. Really great, really nice. And you notice, you hear the camera click. That's it being kicked out of live view. So we can also come in and download images. It's connecting to the database. Most of these are of my blinds because I've been shooting the blinds. In order to view raw images, we can change the display options. In the display options, we have the ability to select the movie we just shot. We can download it. It's going to tell us the file size. That's going to take a while to download. But if you didn't have the ability to get your computer and take your memory card out and transfer, this gives us a way to do it, and we could post it online. I love it. I love that ability. We can select all the images that we want to transfer over just by selecting them. So another feature that's kind of cool about this is you can see that I have pictures on here taken from other cameras. It has the dates. This was the Z6, I think. This was, I can't remember all of them, but the 850, the Z6, the Z7, the Z50, and the camera remembers it. And so we also have the ability to go onto the cloud if we wanted to. So there's a lot of cool settings in here. So we're in Wi-Fi mode. If we turn it off, we'll end the connection. Sometimes it'll kick you out automatically. That's one of the things that kind of drives me crazy is when I leave the app. Listen, sometimes it kicks you out. Let's see what's going on here. Yeah, it's turned off. So you can see that when you leave the app, it'll sometimes just kick you out. It's kind of attention hungry. But in any event, that is how you connect to the SnapBridge app. It's not perfect, but it does work once you get it connected with Wi-Fi. I'm not a huge fan of the Bluetooth, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me give you some gear and lens recommendations. It's important to remember that we have an FX body. That means we're dealing with a full frame 35mm size sensor. There are DX lenses out there. So when you're purchasing your lenses, whether it's on a store or maybe buying it off somebody, make sure that it's FX. Otherwise, you're going to get a smaller image circle on your stills. You can shoot in DX mode if you want, but it's not going to utilize the entire sensor and your resolution is going to go down. If you are interested in doing portraits and you're on a budget, I think you have to go with the Nikon 85 1.8. It's about $400. It's a pretty good value if you do a lot of portraits. Good place to start. I love my 24-70 2.8 Nikon lens. I've had it for a long time. They're expensive. There's all different kinds now, but we have to give notice to the Tamron 24-70 2.8 G2. I think it's a tremendous value. It has image stabilization. It is very highly rated and very highly reviewed. One of my favorite lenses for my Nikon systems is my 70-200 2.8 FL ED zoom. I love it. I use it in my sports test. It's an incredibly sharp lens. It's also $2,800. It's kind of expensive, and I don't expect everybody to have the budget for it. I think the 70-200 2.8 G2 Tamron is a really good substitute if you're looking for best bang for your buck. If you need something with a little bit more extra reach, you're probably looking at Nikon's 200-500. That lens is phenomenal if you're doing wildlife shooting. I also think it's a tremendous value. There's a number of wide angle lenses out there that I really think that the Tamron 15-30 2.8 is probably a better value as well. If you're new to videography, you are definitely going to want to get an external microphone. The microphone in the camera is okay, but as we handle the microphone, it's not the best. So an external microphone is going to greatly improve your audio quality, and you'll be happy to learn that I have gone through a ton of testing. We had 400 respondents test microphones, and the #1 winner is now known as the Maven Mini Mic. I put this together in a kit. It comes with a dead cat, which will reduce wind noise, things of that nature. That link is in the description. If you don't already have a tripod, you're going to want to get one. You can spend anywhere from $50 to $500 for a good set of tripod legs. I personally use the carbon fiber Bogen Manfrotto legs, and I like a locking ball head. The 496 RC2 is the one I still use. I've had it for 8 or 9 years. There's something similar to it out on the market today. I'll put those links in the description as well. At some point, you're going to want to try external speedlights. It's a flash, and the model that I recommend is the Godox TT 685N. Costs about $110, and I also cover this on the crash course. I will show you how to use it, how to set it up, and get started with flash photography. You can even get a master remote that will allow you to put the flash off camera for another $60 or so. it's a tremendous value. If you enjoyed this tutorial and you feel like you learned something about your camera, I would strongly recommend my Nikon D780 Crash Course, where I will show you the advanced techniques and shooting skills, as well as the basics that you will need to just crush it with your camera. I will put that link in the description. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you on the Crash Course.